Good morning, and welcome everyone to How Being Trauma Informed Improves Criminal Justice System Responses. This is a training developed by the Gaines organization and being provided under the Northeast Caribbean Addiction Technology Transfer Center. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Diane Padilla. I am the presenter for the next little while that we're committed to being here together. For those of you who I haven't met yet, I'm looking forward to hearing about your experiences. So let me go through a couple of logistical details before I start to speak to what we're going to be working on today. So first, logistically, I know you want to know that your certificate completion will, as usual, what we'll do is we'll stop about a few minutes before the end time, which is, so we're here for 4 hours. A few minutes before, we will stop, and you will have enough time to fill out an evaluation, or what we call our GIPers. And so that is another way we take a time this as well. It'll justify us to be able to send you the certificates for your CEs. Along with that, you do have an activity packet that we will go through today that is going to help us kind of do some actual interactive work. This webinar is approved for 4 hours of KSAC, CPP, and CPS credentialing. And as you were informed, rather, I don't want to say told, as you were informed in the confirmation letter once you registered, is that we hope that you be present throughout the entire session. You already know I am Diane Padilla. I'm a research project manager at the Northeast Caribbean Addiction Technology Transfer Center. I also am the same for the Prevention Technology Transfer Center. I am the screening brief intervention referral to treatment, technical assistance and implementation specialist. And the other hats, very similar to you all, the other hats is I do a myriad of other things. And that I'm lucky enough to do that has me working with some of you folks more directly than just in this general environment of a webinar or a training. And so, but there is in-person, there's in-person experiences, direct services experiences, and I am hoping to encourage you folks to kind of think about your own as well and bring that to this training. Disclaimer, development of the materials is supported by a grant from the Center of Substance Abuse Treatment and Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services, that's SAMHSA. And so we're responsible to ensure that what we bring you is credible, innovative, information and skill sets. So technology transfer centers are funded by SAMHSA. Their way of saying, listen, they support you doing all that hard work, and this is one of the ways where they make sure you get all the information you need to keep your level of competencies, elevated, and make sure that you continue to have those hours you need towards your licenses and credentials. So, and then of course, language matters. So the language we use is really important to how it reinforces our own ideas and further influences our actions and interactions with the client or patient community that we work with. And so we try to put people first, even despite the fact that we could have been in the field for a very long time and use words like substance abuse or substance dependence. We're really encouraged not to use those in terms of who the people are who we provide services to, because they're not their illness, and we don't want to label them. And somewhere along the line, we started to kind of lose sight of that. Some of the terminology were more stigmatic and kind of pushed people away from getting services, or played a part at least, and it wasn't the only one. So we're encouraged not to change what we were taught a long time ago. So as skills, interventions, initiatives evolve, so do our competencies. So we want to use language that empower people and put them first, and we want to promote best practices by being affirming and empowering to the people who are in need that we provide services to. So let me start right there. So awesome. So I see a lot more people online and visual. This is great. Thank you very much. And if you haven't put your name in the chat box, and follow like just like follow suit like just everyone else. If you could put your full name and your organization, that would be great. If you haven't done it already, for those who did, thank you. So a couple of things, because we typically have a nice healthy amount of folks, and I can only see, let's see, the most my screen visually, my screen I can see is 25 people. Yeah, 25 people at a time. So I can't see everyone else who may be on the platform right away. I do go back and forth and I scroll because I like to see people's faces, and that's just me as a presenter. But I also want to be able to engage you in a conversation because your experience is so priceless to any of the topics that we bring here. And so, in order for me to know that you want to add something, when I ask questions, I am looking for responses, but I would like you not to jump, not to just unmute and just talk. I would encourage you, I really encourage you to raise your electronic hand. But I see all the electronic hands. Okay, thank you. And the reason for that is we've gotten so good at that, haven't we? So the reason for that is just because I don't want to miss anybody. And when your hands, when you raise your electronic hands, you automatically go to on top, like a top of the list, and you're no longer in a chronological order in the participant pool. And so I don't want to miss your voice. And I think we can all hear from each other. I think that is so awesomely important. And so again, I'm going to stress throughout the training, let's not unmute and just jump in. Let's not do that. I'm going to give you a chance to do that. We're going to do breakout groups. Okay, so we'll do one, maybe two, not sure. So here we go. And so what we're going to do is try to get this dialogue going. I'm hoping that you can add to it. But as you notice, the name of this training is How Being Trauma Informed Improves Criminal Justice Responses. So we will be discussing trauma in a very different way. So we have several trauma courses that we present to you. Many times we tell you what the diagnostic perspective is, what we see in behaviors, how we apply it in our settings, and that's all great. The thing with this one that makes it different is that we're going to hear from the actual individuals who were impacted by trauma. So my biggest concern at first is your wellness, really. And so when we're not actively engaged doing direct services or our regular routine every day in our work, and when we're in a training, sometimes we kind of relax a little bit. So I'm just more concerned about your wellness in terms of if anything triggers up, what you can do to take care of yourself. So for us to have the discussion, we have to be open to hearing sometimes some of the details of what it felt like for individuals. And our empathetic side might kind of get caught up in that. And if it triggers anything with you personally, I need to make sure that we have an understanding that we can like step away from the monitor, and we can turn off the video for a little bit, just step away, see if you can get yourself grounded, do the breathing exercise. Something that happens when trauma kicks up in an individual is they feel it physically first. And so when you start to do breathing exercises, it kind of calms down the biological systems, your breathing, your heart rate, so if it can slow it down, then you're better able to kind of just stay in get back to a calm space. And then when you're ready, come back to the platform. Is that okay with everyone? Okay, really important. You first, and then we'll talk about what we need to talk about. Okay, excellent. So everybody can put their hands down now. And let's see what else do I have. So breakout rooms, there's one activity for sure that we have a breakout room, and I know you have an activity packet. Just just follow my lead. There are certain ones that we're not going to do exactly the way the packet says. This is really a 6-hour course, and I wanted to bring it to you folks, and Clyde and I tried bringing it to you before, and we had some technical issues. And so we are actually doing a 4-hour version of the 6-hour. And so these videos are lengthy, anywhere between 10 and 15 minutes. I'm going to need you to kind of pay attention. There are some questions I'm going to ask you afterwards. We'll process as a large group, and then we'll also be able to process as a small group in one of the activities I picked out for you. There is a break. you get to have a break, 15 or 20 minutes, depending on where we're at in the content. Um, and it's typically like almost like halfway through, give or take a few minutes, depending on the conversation. Um, the other thing, sometimes I think we're really good at what we do. And I just want to make sure that when we share any comments, any experience, or anything, any perspective, that we try to share it from the I perspective. Sometimes we say things here, may or may not be something that we agree with, but that doesn't really matter. You have to work from where you're at and be able to meet people where they're at in your practice. But we don't kind of judge anybody else. We kind of come from the eye and what works for us. And when we do that, we have a really nice opportunity to share strategies. And that's nice. And sometimes folks will ask questions here, and I'll just ask you folks, what do y'all think? Because you guys help each other quite a bit, and I take advantage of that when the opportunity comes up. Other than that, anything else that you think we should kind of put up front? Just mention? Anything missing? Okay. I'm going to go through some slides. We're going to start this off, and then we'll go to a video. I'll let you know just when we're going to do that. All right. So, how being trauma informed improves criminal justice system responses. This particular training was actually designed for the individuals who work in the criminal justice system. And what has been found over time is that this is also helpful and very insightful in terms of many of you who work with individuals who have been involved with the criminal justice system at some point or may have a history or. And so this is applicable for that too. And I know a lot of you are working with drug courts or problem solving courts or working with other organizations that help integration, for folks coming out of the prison or prison system. And so hopefully this is valuable to you. So why learn about trauma? So some of the things that we know about is if we understand about trauma, we can better understand how to respond to it. And that's the whole mindset here. It's also that when we can start to understand some of those dynamics, we can better inform the systems that are in place. We already know that a lot of the systems that are in place are very limited in terms of being able to address individual human needs for people who may have trauma. And so there's a lack of understanding or lack of information that can help inform responses. And so this is all part of that. I bet that you probably have, a lot of this information, but we're going to put it within the context of the criminal justice system. So some of the benefits include knowing and understanding that trauma rates are very high. There is no way and there's no time better than now that we can actually say that, considering the last 4 years that we have survived. And so, and I say we because everybody had to survive those last 4 years. The folks that we provide services to, us ourselves, within the context of that environment, a lot of trauma increased for a lot of folks. And a lot of different other stressors have remained high for a lot of people. And so some of that includes, for instance, there was a jail diversion study that indicated that women had up to a 96% lifetime notice of experience of trauma. Currently, within the last 12 months when they did the survey, the predominant amount of folks, 74% of women had trauma issues. So men had 89% during their lifetime, 86% currently. And this is pretty neat in terms of understanding that many times when we first started to gather data with men and women, we didn't necessarily have these numbers as high for men, mostly because there was a point where we were not as able to elicit this information. It was harder for males to actually kind of share this information. But we're getting more accurate numbers now. And so the other thing was the mental health court study also identified that 67% of women had child abuse, some physical child abuse, and currently had 34% were experiencing sexual and physical abuse. With men, the numbers were 73% and 32%. Um, 73% of child abuse. And 32% had currently, were experiencing physical and sexual abuse. And so we noted, and I bet it kind of comes up, maybe reminding you of the ACEs study, and we're going to speak to that in a minute. The idea with trauma is that for a lot of folks, even people who have been managed to have interventions to be able to get the help they need and to be able to process past traumatic events, the past is never dead, never completely dead. It does not eliminate, it's not erased. Imprints are left behind. And that's for those who have actually processed. And for many people are not necessarily aware that that traumatic experiences that they may have had, especially since childhood, are still impacting how they live, how they think, what they do in their life today. So for many people, it's not even past. So I'm going to mention here, before I go back, I said, so that's kind of like the framework of the direction we're going in. I'm going to show you the first of several videos. This is a little lengthy. This is about 10 minutes long. I need you to pay attention to the best of your ability. Understanding might be, it can be very detailed. So, and you'll know what I mean when I do this. And then we'll come back and we'll process that as a, okay?
The men abusing us children, she's playing like she's too high to recognize what's going on, or she's so high that she doesn't even know what's going on. Different things like that went on all the time in my household.
Call all sorts of derogatory names. You know, you'll never be this, you'll never make it out there, you're gonna be a bum, you know, a drug addict, in prison for the rest of your life, or somebody gonna kill you early. Some beatings seem like they last a lifetime. Broom handles, shoes, belts, fists, and we was pretty bruised up. A lot of times I believe that they were so disappointed in themselves that they just transferred that anger to us.
It came from the name calling: big, fat, black, ugly. You never amount to nothing. Don't nobody want you. You stupid, you dumb, you retarded, you crazy. Things like that. Those name calling actually put me to where, you know, I felt like I had to defend myself because I didn't have anybody. And when you get called names like that, especially from family, it was like, okay, so now I don't really have nobody. So now my defense is my hands. That's what's gonna protect me, is my hands. And that's what I did. I fought.
We got whipped all the time with sticks. My mother would go out and get branches off the tree and braid them together and whoop us. I don't know why I was being whooped, right? My sister, my oldest sister, also had that advantage. When we didn't do something for her, when we told on her, she just used to punch us. She didn't use a switch. She didn't use an extension cord. She used to punch us. When I was in 4th grade, this is a great sense of that, I was just tired. One day I just got tired, and there was this girl who kept picking on my sister and I when we get off the bus. And one day I just decided, she had gotten the whole projects together saying, I'm going to get this little girl. That was me. When I got off the bus, there was this big crowd around, and this girl, Deborah, decided to just jump on me. And when she jumped on me, that first thing that I thought of was I was tired of being hit. I beat the crap out of her. And I was going to kill her. I wanted to kill her. I just wanted to kill her so no one else would hit me. And when I got home from 4th grade, I realized I didn't want my mother doing that to me anymore. And that's the day that I stood up. And from that day until, you know, I was 29 years old, that's what I learned to do, was fight to take care of myself. So in the house of growing up, when someone said something to me, I got big. And because it felt good to fight, it felt good to make somebody less than who I was.
I used to be bullied. That made me angry. Because come to find out that the same people that was bullying me were scared themselves. And once I got started fighting and all that stopped. Then I became the bully. And I really didn't like that, but it was all about a survival thing. It was either predator or prey. And I was tired of being the prey. So I turned to the predator.
the way we lived with the whippings and how that happened was part of the social construct of our culture in that community. When I grew up, it was something that we knew that would happen if we talked back to an adult or did something that an adult didn't like. There were these kids on the corner that no adults would talk back to. I just come from a place where you didn't talk back to adults, and I watched these kids have an amazing time on the corner. So eventually I went up there just to talk to them. I wanted to be just like them because nobody messed with them. After some time of going up there and interacting with them, one day I went up and they just beat the crap out of me. I mean, literally, I could not get up and move. My mother wondered what happened. I said, oh, I got in a fight in school. That day I had actually gotten beat into a gang. And I didn't know. I didn't say I wanted to be. I didn't know what a gang was. I didn't know I was in a gang. I just know that after they beat me up that day, they loved me. And I was able to hang out with them. They shared everything. If somebody said something to me, they were right there with me, had my back. So I learned to smoke, cuss, and to be big and to learn how to fight. I ended up in and out of jail, in and out of the mental health system, in and out of homelessness, all through that time.
I spent 30 years in prison. I fought to save myself to continue to be a man. Because when I went in at 16 years old, and back then they call you what is called pretty young boys, you know, a fresh meat. To prove myself to the people around me that I'm not to be messed with, I acted out against the inmates, I acted out against the guards. There was no talking to me. There was no understanding. It was either my way or no way, which kept me in a lot of trouble, kept me locked up a lot. Even while I was locked up in prison, I was locked up in SEG. I never could be at peace because there was so much rage and anger inside of me.
In prison, like I say, just like on the street, you are either a predator or a prey. At times, there's going to be somebody that's going to try. And unfortunately, you have to hurt them. Because if you don't, then there's going to be like a whole line of people that's going to try to get at you. But, I don't like it, but it was even done with me. And I ain't the one to get, getting beat up or stabbed up without retaliating.
By being molested, that really did trigger a lot of things on the inside. I became very aggressive. I actually caught a charge at an early age. I started fighting at the age of 10 years old, started getting suspended from school. At the age of 12 years old, I continued to get into fights all the way up to my teen years. Until I was about 15 years old was when I first caught my first charge.
I experienced different forms of physical abuse. My mom would sleep for a very long time when she was coming off drugs, and while she was sleeping, it would be for days. And I'd have to wake her up, and she would hit me or push me. She would yell at me a lot. But when it came to corporal punishment, she kind of left that up to her boyfriends. She'd let her boyfriends spank me with spoons or with belts. And with each boyfriend, because they were so many and they were so frequent, that I was really just getting hit by strange men. I've witnessed her be beaten one time. It was something I might have heard a lot behind closed doors, but when I was 11 years old, my mom's boyfriend had showed up and I had some words and I left. And I was about halfway down the block when I heard him calling my mom names. So I ran back into the house. I watched him beat her from the top of the stairs all the way down. I saw her cowered at the bottom of the stairs, and she was bleeding everywhere. Became very aggressive towards men, and probably really, really young. I'd say after I saw my mom get beat that one time, it's really sad, but I remember thinking, how pathetic. Look at her. How can she just allow that to happen? And for a long time, watching my mom fall down the stairs, even though I felt I needed to save her, I just thought, that's so sick. So I became aggressive. Like, I would be an instigator. I would instigate any situation that I thought was going to go to a violent level because I felt I needed to have the upper hand. I didn't feel I could really defend myself because I was pregnant, and I was probably about seven and a half months pregnant when he had wrapped a phone cord around my neck and he had dragged me through the apartment and down the stairs and outside. He ended up going to jail for that. That scene, it lasted 2 days. Before he had dragged me down the stairs, he had ripped some folding doors, like folding closet doors, off the hinges, and he had beat me with them. He had hit me in the face many times. And after that incident, once again, I looked at the situation and I felt like I was pathetic. And so became just a violent, I became an abuser. I was an abuser.
Even today, sometimes when I'm with my mom and I look at her and I just wonder what went through her mind when she, did those things to her children, and what was she thinking about. And the only thing I can think of is because she herself had been abused by someone in her family and never had it taken care of. She never received any type of treatment for it. I was 15 the first time I was arrested myself, and it was for assaulting my cousin on my maternal side. I just thought that, I could hit someone and it not be an issue. I carried a lot of anger around with me for a long time, and I took it out on the people that treated me the best, because they were such an easy target for me to be angry with. And my thinking behind it was to give back what I was getting.
Okay. Interesting video, isn't it? All right, so is everybody okay? All right, good. So, first question, and please raise your hand. No unmuting by yourself. Please raise your hand, because this gets really interesting. So I want to ask you, as far as you saw in the video, yes, several different people speak to you about their lived experiences, what happened to them since childhood. How is violence cyclical? Can we speak to that? Good morning, Anais. Anais? That's how I say, that's correct, right? Anais?
Yeah. Can you hear
Okay.
me?
Yes.
Okay. I think the pattern that I saw was a lot of them expressing that there was some sort of physical violence for them in their youth, and then they realized, based on the relationship to the person who was physically being abusive to them, that they didn't have anybody to count on. So they didn't have that connection or that safe space, and then they felt that they had to be the defender. And the only way they knew was the way that it was communicated to them, which was violence. And so they, out of a need to survive and defend themselves and try to prevent further abuse, they then became aggressive and expressed that aggression. And unfortunately, as a child, into adulthood, aggression is the quickest way to end up within the criminal justice system, right? Because you can't go around putting your hands on people just because they make you upset or they remind you of something that happened in the past. So there was a lot of unaddressed trauma there associated and related to physical violence, and they were doing what they knew, which was to be violent.
Okay. All right, thank you. Hi, good morning, Alexandra. How was violence cyclical? You're still muted. So I think she's typing her response. Okay. So it kind of goes with what Anais was saying before. Okay, thank you. Learned behavior. Thank you, Alexandra. Veronica, good morning. Nice to see you.
Yes, good morning. Long time no see. So I was going to say it's a learned behavior. And two, it goes back into parents parenting the way that they were parented. So, and the reason why I say that is because, I mean, coming up the way that I came up, my grandmother beat my mother. So then in turn, she beat me. That type of situation. That's number one. And I know it sounds kind of strange, but you know, when you look at how parents were parented and how they parent their children, it's similar to the way that they were brought up. That's one. The other thing is too is not having the tools in order to manage the anger, because when there's no tools to manage the anger, there's always going to be an outlashing, always. Also the environment, not just necessarily in the home, because if you have children and or adults who have grew up in that type of situation, it continues until somebody is able to break the cycle.
Okay, thank you, Veronica. Nicely articulated. Hi, Timothy.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Hi, good morning. Briefly, I have a history when I was a child of a lot of PTSD stuff. And I guess my opinion in terms of how those things become cyclical a little bit is that when you're some of, and again, not, but some of my PTSD has to do with like neglect and abandonment, that kind of stuff. And so I think you get to a point with the PTSD reactions, you know, a lot of the fight stuff that in the beginning, I think people experience a lot of they're shut down. They, you know, they just let somebody hit on them as children, et cetera, or they just kind of take it. And I think you kind of learn part of the learned behavior isn't just the violence. I think part of the learned behavior is you're on your own. It's up for you to have general survival, so to speak, et cetera, et cetera. And, you know, that's not always even conscious. It's like it's just sometimes as a person, you know, just surviving and coping and putting up with stuff. And I think sometimes in extreme situations, when those buttons get pushed, it pushes that extreme fight or flight. And as people get a little older, or stronger, whatever, you know, whatever the case may be, everybody's different, of course, and what happens to them. But I think what happens is, because I know, especially when I was younger, not so much anymore, lots of therapy. I think it gets to a point where that button gets pushed and either you have an extreme flight, literally, whether that be disassociation or just, you know, running to no, I think that switch flips a little and you become angry. And I think that when you're already angry, but I think that anger button becomes released in the point of, I got nothing else to lose. You know, I've taken this, I've taken that, I put up with that, I'm on my own. This is it. And I think children can do that too. And so long story short, I think that's part of a lot what happens. Where that cycle comes in, I think, is that I don't think people, unless they're working on healing and understanding and just, you know, getting through some of their junk, you know, or they haven't had those opportunities, frankly, or the resources. I think they get to a point where they don't always know how to communicate those things about themselves to the people that might matter around them. And then therefore, consciously and unconsciously, those things are taught, meaning we don't talk about this, you know, this is private, this is your problem, you know, those kinds of things, if that makes sense. And I'll stop, I'm going on and on. But I guess I just wanted to say, I think some of the cycle stuff is, it's not even that, you know, it's just what we see and hear that we're learned. It's that on the inside, what we learn and how to express or not express those things. And at some point it comes out. Because, you know, the violence can be verbal, you know, the violence can be extreme neglect, you know, it isn't always physical. Oftentimes it is. But I think on the psychological level, that's kind of what's up. And thank you. That was long. I'll stop talking.
Thank you. You gave a lot. I really appreciate that, Timothy. You gave a lot of insight and a lot of associated factors as well to this. And I think we're going to unpack some of that, continue to unpack some of that this morning. Good morning, Deborah.
My thing is I think it's trauma begets trauma. So everybody's trauma builds up to everybody else's trauma. So they're, you know, the beatings and the so on and so forth. And it's not dealt with. So like some of the classes that I give at where I do, we talk about the iceberg. You see the top of the iceberg, but you don't know what's underneath. And so same thing. If you don't deal with what's underneath, and it's just going to keep rolling out. So that's why I said trauma begets trauma, because it just keeps going unless it's being dealt with.
Yeah. Yeah. Just figure, thank you everyone for your comments. Thank you, Deborah. Thank you everyone for your comments. We think about this when we think about what was being said by these different individuals who were brave enough and courageous enough to share with us their story. I think that's a big deal. I think we can't help but understand that learned behavior kind of comes when you're developing and you only see either you see the victimization and you see the predator. So it was interesting that that one individual, and his name was Thomas, and Thomas talked about you either be a predator or a prey. How you do what you know. If this is what you see and this was what you're going with, and you're not seeing exactly individuals or models of individuals or experiences where people actually process information, where people actually talk through situations and things like that, if this is what you tend to grow up with, you do what you know. That conditioning process and is just part of that development. That from kids to adulthood and even influences us as adults as well. And so let's unpack that a little bit more. Thank you so much for what everybody offered. It really kind of brings us back to why we're trying to learn about trauma in the first place. So we want to understand on a deeper level. And I know some of this information may be somewhat basic, but it's all going to correlate. Want to increase our awareness. We want to recognize signs, because you notice that a lot of these folks, when they were talking from that binary perspective, either victimization or predator, they weren't necessarily speaking at a younger time when they were evolving and transitioning into this aggressive role. They weren't necessarily sharing with us that they were aware that there may be another way and this was a choice. And so their own awareness didn't come to much later, and it came with help, with therapy. And so for us as providers, when we see reactions or certain behaviors from the clients, the patients we work with, we want to understand so we can recognize the signs, so we can understand how we can respond. And the thing about it is it increases safety. Increases safety for you, increases safety for the other individual, reduces recidivisms, promotes recovery. I mean, think about it. I remember I had a client one time and working in a halfway house. And this was when I was doing direct services back in the day. And I remember that, so we had 10 beds for women and 10 beds for men on another floor. And so there was this one young girl one young lady, and when she first came in, there was the light used to get turned off. I believe it was by 10 o'clock. Had lights off on the floor, and I said everybody had to be in bed, and we had to do the check-ins. She wouldn't turn the light off, and so by the time I did a night shift, and I heard that there were issues with, and the staff were trying to get the light, turn the lights off. And so, and it was only a few days when I first did a night shift when she came into the agency. I asked her what was the issue. Was there a problem with turning the light off? And she decided, and it was in the approach, and she decided to share with me and another colleague, my supervisor at the time, about how at nighttime it reminds her, she starts getting these flashbacks. It reminds her of what her stepdad used to do when she was a kid. We didn't know that. It wasn't in the assessment. It wasn't part of the paperwork. It wasn't part of the data that was gathered initially when she was first admitted into the halfway house. So instead of jumping the gun and saying, oh, that wonderful word non-compliance and trying to sanction her for anything, it was really about, let's find out what's going on. Let's see what's going on with the individual. And that's what we learned, because that started to inform our policies after that, because we had to leave the line apart. So we gave her those plug in the walls night lights, so it doesn't, because they were bunking with other people, and so it doesn't disturb the others, but she had the light out for herself. So we were able to kind of do a response, a trauma-informed response, before trauma-informed initiatives were a big deal, and so the whole thing was just about asking, finding out, exploring, and not jumping the gun and to some kind of judgment or conclusion without actually getting the person's feedback. So why are we learning about trauma? Is it because we have a lot of situations that are very applicable? And so let me go back to here. So let me see. So what is trauma? How do you folks define trauma? What's your understanding? You can put it in the chat box, or you can raise your hand. Either one. How do you define trauma? Very good, Francisco. It is a wound. Do you want to elaborate just a little bit more? What kind of wound? Come on, you started it.
What kind of wound?
Yeah. See.
Well, for me, I get the wound from the original or the Greek root of the word trauma, which means wound. So there can be an immense amount of wounds, all different kinds, deep cut, superficial, which is why we need immense amount of approaches, right?
So you're talking about a physical aspect, but we're also talking about psychological aspect or emotional aspect. Is that correct? See, I knew that's where you were going. Thank you. Jared, good morning.
Good morning, everybody. Trauma is a wound. I'm gonna give you guys an example. I was shot in the chest, and I was being robbed. A firearm was put in my face. Pushed the firearm on my face. I stepped back. The person shot me, and I played dead. He came up to shoot me again, but I played dead. And he ran off. I said that to say this. I still have the marks from the surgery they gave me to make sure I was okay. I still have the wounds. So when he said wound, it brought me right back to the place, just like the example you just gave with the lights being turned on and off. It brought me right back to the place where I was when the incident took place. So trauma is a situation where hurt is involved. And it don't even feel good going back to that scenario right now. But it arises when I get reminders. It arises, and that's trauma to me. Thank you for letting me share.
Jared, and thank you for sharing that personal experience. And my final thing is that's a lot of strength when you do that. You know, you get the more you do that, and you're able to rechannel that. They call that post-traumatic growth. You're able to help other people with that too. So thank you for doing that. Brianna, good morning. How do you define trauma?
Good morning. So I don't know if I think everybody can hear me. I teach psychopathology on a graduate level, and when we try to teach the graduate students that, you know, trauma is not just something that someone directly experiences, but something that you can get secondhand from what you may hear, or something that you can have repeated exposure to secondary. And to include those things and things not just happening based on human behavior. So not just actions of human behavior, but also things by nature. COVID was, because we consider, and when we teach the graduate students, COVID was a trauma for a lot of people. So things, Hurricane Katrina and things of that nature, things by nature. And also things that challenge people's worldviews, events and behaviors that, you know, happening in your environment that challenge your worldviews. They all have an aspect of trauma related to them.
Yes, thank you, Brianna. Thank you for that. So let me bring it back to what I have in the course. So trauma. So often what you hear is, and this just speaks to what you're saying, but what you folks were sharing actually evolved this specific slide a lot more. So many times as an experience is an event, there's some kind of stimuli that occurs. And it's really how the person experiences that. And I'll just take it a little further, say how that individual interprets that situation. Brianna and Jared and others I was speaking to how even remembering certain things can bring back like feelings. Brianna spoke about secondary trauma, like being exposed to something for a long period of time. Very much with us, you know, is vicarious trauma within the work we do. But it's really about how an individual experiences or interprets a situation that causes an experience that has to do, that's maybe based on fear or threat, you know, danger. And it's the effects, the often either short either acute or long-term effects caused that results from it, not cause, results from it. So it's not the event that causes it, but that's a component of it because there's some kind of stimuli, some kind of situation that an individual experiences as threatening, experiences as dangerous. And so traumatic events are much like what you folks said. There's a host of different things. We do know that we can say, so for instance, the Hurricane Katrina in Puerto Rico was Hurricane Maria. Just Hurricane Sandy on the East Coast here some years ago. A lot of those are traumatic events for a lot of folks. The past 4 years had us existing in a fear-based atmosphere. It was very hard for a while there to understand how to go, how to interact, what to do, how to even leave the house safely without thinking that they're going to be that we would be infected and maybe possibly die. And so those were real fears. And when we have experiences like that, they often build upon previous experiences that may have been threatening and fear-based also. And so a lot of that, how the person interprets that, and we'll talk about how the physical, somebody mentioned the sympathetic nervous system, that was Timothy. So we'll talk about how the individual experiences that physically. So it's really about how different situations, different events happen to people. And a lot of these voices that you heard that was spoken about was started to happen to them when they were children. So the physical abuse, we mentioned the natural disasters, the sexual abuse, it was mentioned the secondary vicarious trauma. Combat, veterans who have been in combat theater, we've learned so much from them. They were, and we still learn a lot from the researchers in the VA about how the traumatic impact of being in combat theater has affected individuals. And for many of us, we know how that may have played a part into people getting caught up in addiction or substance use. And historical community trauma is not it's not to get that for many people, the cumulative effects of complex PTSD or the complex trauma can be about what some communities have felt or have gone through over generations, and how that can get triggered with different present day situations. And so those memories that are actually in our genes and cognitively and psychologically, what can be triggered and put us in a precarious place because of environmental issues, environmental experiences. All of these can speak to traumatic events. But at the same token, it can also be that person who was watching their parents fight all the time and they finally got divorced. And that could have been devastating for an individual if they hadn't learned, if they didn't have any coping skills or any way to process that in a healthy manner. Most children don't. So things like that, having to relocate and losing your best friend in the whole wide world, and you're about 8 years old, that can be traumatic. So it really depends on the individual and how they interpret the experiences. And so as we're going to go through, I'm going to ask you to go to, we're going to talk about, I'm going to ask you some more questions about another video that we're going to do right now. Let me see what you're saying in the chat box. Yeah, so events leave an imprint. The psyche and the body, as I said before. So even for folks who have processed, The thing is that when you do have interventions, when you do get help, when you do get therapy, for many people, they are no longer being heavily influenced by their past. Different triggers can bring up the memories, but you don't necessarily relive them. You might be reminded of them. You might have even an emotional response, but you don't necessarily relive them. It's a very different place. It really depends. And there's too many variables, and it depends on the individual. Some trauma is related to life events like personal experiences, events that change your life and your worldview. Your environment probably creates trauma. So I don't have the slides here because this is video based, but we do know there's an ACEs too. We know adverse childhood experiences, which many of these folks were sharing about, and how it spoke to how they went through life and became the predator as opposed to a victim. and how that was associated with other behavior. Like, for instance, one of the women were talking about how she got into the gang life and how that was associated in that perspective. And so one thing kind of, these situations lead to a whole lot of other things. An emotional response, an incident that occurred in our life is different from everybody. And there's a lot of common elements, but it's a very individualized process. So now we're going to think about trauma from a different perspective. We sometimes we think about law enforcement and we don't necessarily think, I used to think that they're not necessarily equipped to deal with situations where an individual may have a mental health or might have a psychosis, and maybe they're not as equipped to be able to deal with them in an appropriate way, and like de-escalation skills and being able to address someone in a particular way. And sometimes they really do. And we don't always think about how the officers themselves can have traumatic experiences. And here we're going to hear two people who are going to speak to their experiences. Here I'm going to ask you to do something very specific. Think about the words or the phrases that you hear these individuals kind of mention in terms of how they describe their experiences.
Lady at 46 South Road. 10:33 in the morning, a call got dispatched for my sector for a man beating a woman. So I wound up responding to the call, and I had 2 units backing me up at that time. When I got to the gas station where the incident was allegedly taking place, I exited my car and I looked around and there was nobody there except for 2 women sitting in a car. And I went to go talk to the women, seeing if they had seen the alleged attack that had taken place. At that moment, a man came around the corner of the mini market and said to me, as he started to approach, I said to him, "I'll be with you in a minute, wait by this car that was there, a yellow Jeep." To which he cupped his hand to his ear and he said, "You want me to do what?" I figured he couldn't hear me, so I repeated myself, and he then started to approach again, saying, "You want me to wait where?" And by that point, he had just closed the space between me and him. He wound up at that point punching me in the face and leg sweeping me. As that happened, the radio that was in the holder on my gun belt wound up getting dislodged. He started beating me, hitting my head up and down on the pavement, and he started talking about how women shouldn't be police officers and how he had to kill me. He was militarily trained. At that point, I remember that he was pulling on my gun, and as he did that, the gun came onto my stomach. It was still, my keepers gave on my gun belt, and now the gun was sitting in the holster on my stomach. And as I tried to hold it in the holster, I remember thinking, if you let this gun come out, you're dead. So then I heard the most sickening sound as the snap on the holster gave way. He stood up over me. He said, "I'm going to fucking kill you." And he pulled the trigger. I saw the flash of the muzzle, and I looked down to see a hole in my chest. I suffered some head trauma. I also had a broken collarbone from the impact of the bullet. My wounds were also included it was about the size of a quarter and almost a half-inch deep wound into my chest, even though the vest they said without the vest it was a fatal shot. The second bullet lodged, it was a ricochet shot, so it lodged 4 inches into my arm, and that was removed at the hospital.
It was in 2004. At the time, I was a mental health officer with the adult probation, intensive probation unit. And I supervised offenders with Axis 1 diagnosis, schizophrenia, bipolar, and other mental health issues. There was a young man who had a long history of early childhood trauma, was on probation for attempting to kill his mother. So on one day, he showed up without an appointment to see the case manager. So I wasn't expecting him. He came into my office while I was writing in some files, and I was very engaged in my work. I didn't notice him come in, and when I did look up, I felt something, and I looked up, and I'll never forget his eyes. It's just like a blank stare. And I asked him to sit down, and he at first was just very silent and stoic and looked at me. And then I said, have a seat. I wasn't expecting you. Have a seat. At that time, my phone is ringing. So I picked up the phone, and it was a case manager's whose office was located on the floor below me, and saying, Mr. So-and-so's parents are here. He's been acting very strangely. He's off his meds. He left the facility without, against medical advice. He knew that we were referring to him, and that's when he just went off and became, the next thing I know, when I looked up, he's holding up a chair, and he just, before I could react, I kind of halfway got up, and then he hit me across the chest and the face, and I just landed on against my credenza. And that's when I remember him being over me, and I could just feel different objects just like happened so fast. Different objects just hitting me. And I tried to defend myself, but it was difficult because it happened so fast. I don't know how much time passed by, but another female officer passed by my office, saw it, and she just screamed. And when she screamed at the top of her lungs, and several male officers came in and tackled them to the floor. They called 911, and the next thing I know, I'm in the ambulance and in the emergency room. They did some x-rays of my head, and they gave me a follow-up. They gave me some pain meds, and I had to do a follow-up with a specialist orthopedic surgeon. And the end result, after numerous visits and EKGs and every kind of test imaginable, they determined that I had extensive damage to my vertebrae, and that required surgery.
To say that when you talk about the incident, it doesn't bring you back, it absolutely does. And I think it also can catch you off guard, because you think you're fine, and then all of a sudden you're like, wait a minute, I can hear my voice cracking, I can hear my voice wavering. And you know, this was almost 6 years ago. And it's really, to me, it'll always be yesterday. It's never going to be put in the time perspective that most other people know it as.
The doctor wanted to keep me out indefinitely. I went back 5 days against medical advice. The symptoms were, my husband was at work, my son was at school. I found myself at home just anxious, angry, frustrated. And I went back to the doctor and I said, I need to go back to work. And he said, we still have a lot of tests to run. And because you're still in the same profession, you run the risk of re-injury. So I said, well, I'm going back. And he said, if you go back against medical advice. And that's exactly what I did. So I stayed out for a week, and I went back within 5 days. The main reason why I was so focused on going back to work, to get busy, so I didn't have to think about it. I wanted to be active and not feel like a victim.
I was also in shock, but I didn't know that I was in shock. So people would tell me things, people were trying to give me advice, kind of telling me what might be coming down the road for me. And I really couldn't, it didn't register with me, because it was just, I was overstimulated. I remember being in a hospital room and hearing the heater in the hospital room go on, and it clicked. And I was awake in a moment's time. It was just as if everything happens, my senses were just overstimulated. I got diagnosed with post-traumatic stress disorder a month after my incident. I didn't really know at that point why I was labeled as such. I knew I didn't sleep well. I knew I was having night sweats. I was hypervigilant. I was very aware of when anything happened around me. I didn't go back to work right away. When I left the hospital, I was living in an apartment at the time. I went back to my apartment. My rib had healed enough where I could go running again. When I tried, I kept on thinking cars were going to take me, that somebody was going to jump out of the car and kidnap me, that I was going to be attacked again. So my regular everyday existence came to a screeching halt because I always thought somebody else was going to injure me or hurt me in some way. And so I just kind of retreated into myself. My mannerisms were very hyper. I just was very much having trouble being in control of a conversation, of being calm. I was very forgetful. I missed appointments a lot of times. A lot of it had to do with the stress and the trauma, things that were not normal for me. And I didn't trust being with anybody because I thought that they were going to hurt me. It really did limit my existence. I didn't realize that trauma takes longer than the physical wounds to actually heal. And I really didn't have a good comprehension of what was going on. I returned back to work in the same car, and I kept on having feelings that it was happening again. There was no way that I could interact with anybody without thinking the result was going to be another fight for my life. I look at it this way. When you go through a crisis, you get broken apart, you're able to put yourself back together. When you live through a trauma, you're shattered. And you can't put the pieces back together, not the same way they were. I think it's a matter of being able to put them back and erect a new life. And that's a grieving process. It's a very long process for it to take place. And as I said, although I was already labeled with post-traumatic stress disorder, I didn't know what it was. Putting on a uniform caused anxiety attacks. I thought people that were driving next to me in cars on the road were going to pull a gun on me. It was so bad that I could no longer function. I would be mowing my lawn, breaking down into tears. I was out for 3 months, and that was all related to the trauma, the emotional healing.
I had disrupted sleep. I had a young child, and I couldn't be disconnected or groggy, so I didn't take a lot of the pain medication or the sleep medication. So I did wake up, disrupted sleep, sometimes violently, sometimes just I couldn't breathe, and my husband would have to wake me up because I felt like I couldn't move, like I was paralyzed. I was hypervigilant, more so not just with myself, but with my child. Sometimes I felt some issues with being in a crowded place because of uncontrollable variables. I became a lot more vigilant of my surroundings. Even in public places, I always had to know who was coming in the door. I always sit in a certain area. Part of my internal conflicts was, you know better, you know how to defend yourself. You could have handled it differently, and there was a lot of guilt and blame on myself, and I was very angry with myself. Mentally and emotionally, I was struggling a lot, but if I kept myself busy, I didn't have to think about it. I experienced some panic attacks intermittently. It was shortly after. I could be in a place where there was absolutely no threat. I could be reading a book at home and start feeling my heart racing. I couldn't breathe. My palms were sweaty. I wanted to jump out of my skin. The depressive symptoms were in every area of my life. I didn't find joy in a lot of things, even my job that I loved. Sometimes the flashbacks occurred when either prompted by something that happened on TV or reading something in the newspaper, and something just simply sitting in the morning having a cup of coffee. The flashbacks occurred sometimes without any prompting or association. I just didn't allow myself to feel. And that not allowing myself to feel hurt some relationships. So I don't know if I was guarded or I was just emotionally unavailable. I tried to deny it. I tried to handle it by myself. I tried to do everything because I'm expected to do so, because I'm strong. But it takes a very strong person to admit when they need help. I don't think you ever get over something like this. It's something that, history is documented so it doesn't repeat itself. So it's something that's there. It's not something that I think about every day, but I do consider it when I'm in places that I don't know. Closure is something that people are always in pursuit of, to say, I just want to put it behind me. My intention is not to put it behind me. My intention is to learn from it.
For law enforcement officers, trials represent closure. So it was a year and a half after the incident, he got sentenced to 18 to life up in Attica. And by June 9th, I was sitting on a therapist's couch saying, I can't go back to work. Will I say that I don't ever think about my incident? I think about it every day. But instead of it overwhelming me, I can at least kind of live with it. It doesn't have as much as the spark or the edge that it used to have. When I used to have intrusive thoughts, where the thoughts would just kind of, in fact, it was what I would hear in this thought that I would get would be 10:33 a.m. and then him saying, I'm going to fucking kill you. And that was I wouldn't be thinking about the incident, and then that would appear. So that doesn't happen. Do I think of my incident every day? Absolutely. But does it debilitate me? No. And as far as dealing with somebody who has mental illness or is emotionally disturbed, it's interesting because when I speak about it, especially to recruits or other officers, I tell them, you know what? If you look in the DSM, I'm there. Post-traumatic stress disorder is a mental illness. So, if anybody were, heaven forbid, have to respond to somebody in emotional crisis, give them respect. Give them their dignity.
What are your thoughts? What do you understand these women not went through, because that was clear, but tell me about what you saw in ways they were initially handling or dealing with it. And then elaborate. Do you want an easier question? How many of these women ran to treatment? Hi, Eula. Good morning.
Good morning. Good morning. They all felt as if they could handle whatever had happened to them, and they didn't think they needed any treatment. They felt they were strong enough, ready to go back to work, and could handle all the stuff they were expected to do every day. But the reality was that thought of what happens to you, it never goes away. Like the lady said, it really never does. You live with that for the rest of your life. Even if you get therapy, it's still there.
Oh, okay. Let's see about that. Let me just nice to see you, Eula. I haven't seen you in a minute. What about when Officer Morales said, that's the second lady, she said, she talked to her doctor. She was going back against medical advice. She gave the reason. Do you remember the reason why she was going back? Do you remember she said? Anybody? Anais?
She wanted to keep busy so she wouldn't think about the incident. She wanted to avoid it.
She didn't want to think about it.
She was anxious and alone.
Yeah, she had symptoms. She was sharing about the symptoms and the things that she was feeling, and she wasn't put on any, and she was dealing with the physical pain, because she said also that she was not taking the pain medications for the physical impact of what happened to her. So that also adds to what she was experiencing. Yeah, Francisco.
I was going to say that the event, well, it puts you at a hypervigilant state, the impact of that, and then it's very difficult to come down from that state. So when you have calmness and peace around you, that in itself is not agreeing to where you're at. and because you're hypersensitive, because you're hyper aware, that's what you're both officers were saying. And then you learn to live at that state, and that heightened state just really is not sustainable, not for anybody.
Yeah, that reminds me more of like when Officer Tully was saying like she couldn't every time everything around her was really triggering her, and it's been in terms of the heightened state, you know, the sympathetic nervous system is what kind of reacts, makes our body react to different situations, and that heightened state that Francisco is talking about is an activated sympathetic nervous system. It's the very thing we need to be able to survive in our world, but it was not designed to stay active consistently all the time. That's not healthy to stay in that hypervigilant place, which is very fundamental to PTSD, which both women had. So even though Officer Tully, the first officer, was speaking to how different things were triggering her, you had Officer Morales who was trying to deal with it slightly differently because she was not comfortable just staying still in her space. She was not comfortable just going to therapy or going to the doctor, even though she had a baby and she had a husband, and you know she's gonna go back to life as normal, and she was actively seeking the distraction of work to not feel. It's very hard to escape, but it's not impossible. How many times have we learned about individuals that we work with? You know, I'm not going to talk about us, but individuals that we work with that actually kind of put that off to the side somewhere and still go back to business as usual in their life and don't process it and kind of learn to just kind of stuff it away somewhere, not realizing or knowing enough about it that it can actually manifest itself in something else, in what we say and what we do, and not be aware of it. Hi, Jared, go ahead.
Hi, I wanted to comment on the part where the officer said she explained to the other officers that she had post-traumatic stress disorder, and she had those issues, and that when they come across regular citizens, that's just like her, you know, and that they should be looked at and be respected the same way. It brought me back to maybe a couple of weeks ago. There was a guy with mental issues, and he had a knife, and there was officers with their guns drawn, right? And I understand he had a weapon, but I also understand that, you know, the officers had guns. There's other ways to deal with things when you're dealing with people with mental health disorders. Um, I felt very disturbed that they just shot him. You know, officers are trained and supposed to protect and serve. And in some situations, even though a person may look like they're willing to harm someone, you don't know what they're going through. You know, ultimately, we all talked about, and I think we all will agree that when somebody goes through something, they give off what they take in. You know, and I just feel like when officers respond, they should have more respect or more concern for someone if they have a weapon that that can't harm them unless they get close to them. You know, it's just my thoughts.
No, thank you so much, Jared. Grisel, yes. Just got to unmute first.
Okay. It's funny. Because you guys, well, usually things like this happen to women, and I work in a admissions office. So a gentleman came in yesterday, and I knew something was wrong because the way he was looking at me, he looked like he was spaced out. Something was wrong. I know things weren't right for him. And once he came in, I said, my name is so and so. And so I started asking him question, and all he started talking was how he left her. He kept saying, I waited for her to go fall asleep. And that was my chance to leave. That was my chance. Miss, I left. And that's, for me, that was, hold on. Because at the beginning, I wasn't really thinking, I know there was something wrong with him, but I didn't know what it was. So when he started sharing about the girlfriend and how, you know, she abused him and how it was like 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 he said, I was non-existent. And you could see the trauma in this man. And like he said at the end, once we finished the interview, he tells me, you know, folks don't know that men get abused. And like that hit me. I don't know, that hit me. Like, you know, it does. Men do go to trauma, you know. Some men, they might show it, some don't. But yeah, that I just wanted to share that.
Thank you, Grisel. So before I go back to Jared's point, Grisel, what you shared about men also going through this. So one of the things I did earlier on, a little while ago, I showed you some statistics that the games folks have gathered, and it showed that the numbers for the men were almost as high for the women. Now, the only thing that I don't like that really should be included here is that if we're looking at population from a binary perspective, we lose sight of a lot of other people. We're talking about gender diverse and transgender people. Their rates of violence and abuse is even higher than everybody else. So let's just include that. And the truth is, there is no specific individual. That's why I had mentioned earlier about if we elicit the information, you know, more men are starting to, we're able to, it depends on our approach, where we're able to elicit that and gather that data that different people do go through these traumatic situations and can be impacting them, which is all speaking to the approach. Now, Jared was talking about, and to what Grisel is kind of speaking to, what I'm thinking about is how do we approach someone like that? First of all, let's just be mindful that the predominant amount of folks who you work with in your programs are good, like up to 85 to 90% of folks have had some traumatic issues in their life at some point. And many of them are currently dealing with issues of trauma, and many of them are dealing with, are being impacted by either past or current trauma issues. So it warrants, it benefits us, it encourages us. Actually, it requires us to be trauma informed with everybody. There is no template poster child here for trauma. It could be very elusive. You can't just look at somebody and say, okay, they're okay. Oh no, they are obviously have issues. No, it doesn't work that way. There are different psychoses that people have with mental health issues, but there is also reactions, which are really normal responses, considering their situations and their capacities that people have. But it really helps us to understand that we need not to judge. We need not to jump. So Grisel was talking about how we think a certain gender may experience this more. Jared was talking about how law enforcement, not just law enforcement, but us too. How do we approach? How do we see folks? How do we understand this enough, the prevalence of this, enough to encourage us to be consciously, intentionally preventive? Being trauma informed is a preventive approach. You know, so we don't re-trigger someone, and we understand that some of those situations that happen don't need a knee-jerk reaction on our part. And that's especially important because many of us who are in the field love to help other people, may have our own traumatic issues. And what we need to understand is something may be happening over there. There must be a reason for that. Definitely safety is going to be an issue, for sure. And heck, you can't do anything if you're not safe. And you can't do anything for the other individual if they're not safe. And your other clients are not safe. And you know, we learn about de-escalation, de-escalating skills here, but the idea here, cognitively, what I want to emphasize is that if someone is behaving a certain way, that's probably a reason. So we don't want to jump to a conclusion about it. We don't know until we find out until we elicit from the individual. So what are the things? We understood that these two officers were affected very specifically behind their traumatic situations. Two different situations with very, very similar components, but two very different individuals, and they were impacted differently, but still impacted very heavily. So what do we do going forward? I thought it was great that the doctor said, listen, if you're going back against medical advice. She was a mental health specialist. When you are in that moment, as much as we know, when we're in that moment, we may not see as clearly. We really could benefit from support around us. Whether it's a clinical supervisor, whether it's a peer, whether it is a psychologist or a therapist, So when it comes to us, so it's the same concept when we're thinking about the client community that we're working with. And so any other comments that kind of come up for you for behind the way this kind of indicated or reflected the trauma, the experience, and the effects? Anything else that comes out for you?
I wanted to say something.
Go ahead, Lisa.
That while I was taking care of that gentleman, I was so involved in the paperwork that all he kept talking and talking. Once he says certain things, certain words that he said, I said, wait a minute. I had to put the pen down and just turn around and just listen to him. I closed the door, and that's when he opened up even more about the things that had happened to him. She bit his tip of his finger off, things like that. And that's when, because sometimes, we do have this paperwork in front of us, and sometimes I have done that we don't even look at the client. And yesterday I said, wait a minute, this guy needs someone at least to talk to him. I'm not, but I just, sometimes we need to be mindful about the signs that the client gives us, not all of them. Sometimes we put a jacket on a certain client and we treat all of them the same, I mean, let's be real. Sometimes we do put that, they, whatever, and sometimes, we lost track of what's important. That's all.
That's a good point. Thank you for that. And so this, I think, okay, so I see Francisco, when we consider how we can be trauma informed with when we look at ourselves, how we engage people and how the processes are when people first come into our setting. One, to understand, how we approach someone and thinking that it's very possible that they may be coming in with some trauma issues, and how do we work with them in a sensitive way? I understand we're busy like crazy. I remember when I was doing very similar work to what you were doing, and there's no such thing as 25 people in a caseload. It's like 100 people, whatever it is, people. It's whatever, whoever's going to cover. And the field is understaffed, you folks are overworked, and I get that. But obviously, you're still going back and forth to your offices because you like what you're doing. Otherwise, you would have made a career change. But seeing how you're here, understanding all that overwhelming stuff that you carry, because part of this is also, like somebody mentioned before, but in the chat, you get impacted too. But we still have to engage people individually. We use person-centered approaches in our care. Everyone is very much the individual, but we also want to be preventive in how we engage someone. How do we start to introduce ourselves? How do we create a safe space? Is it okay? Can we ask permission? Listen, I'm going to close the door so we can have some privacy. Are you okay with that? Bring them into that conversation. It's when we do business as usual routinely that we kind of lose sight, kind of like Michelle was saying, lose the sight of the individual. So it's really an intentional process. And we got some of my skills that we can use to engage folks too. So anyway, let me bring it to Francisco. Francisco, what would you like to add?
Well, okay, thanks. Two things. The first thing is what you're talking about now, that vicarious trauma.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that comes with the work, man. When you're reading about this stuff and hearing about it and sometimes witnessing it day after day or week after week, that's traumatic, man. I mean, you need to know how to cope with that.
Mm-hmm.
Somehow, some way in the work, learn how to heal. But the comment I wanted to make, and forgive you if you're going to cover this later in the thing, is that the videos you showed, to me showed, well, that to me is the lived experience, right? And what I want to put out or comment on is that that lived experience can later on, if you're able to get a good hold, can really can affect the work in a good way. That's what I'm saying. So someone who goes through stuff like that and stays in the field and stays in their job, that can make their work better if they're able to overcome that and bring those hyper awareness levels down, eventually.
So to that last point that you mentioned, Francisco, when I told Jared, when I mentioned to Jared, I thanked him for sharing his lived experience, and I can't even imagine going through that. But I said the way he channels it and shares it and helps other people with it is called post-traumatic growth. Everyone has some level of that. All of you have some level of that. If you just survived before the last 4 years, that alone, you have some level of that. And so you can't do that. I also want to kind of bring attention. I want us to start thinking, what was the factors that you saw in each officer that helped them in the process? Because we're looking at everything that affected them in a negative way. I also want to know what's helped them in the process. Go ahead, Jared.
Yeah, the point that Francisco just brought out, I was thinking that myself because when we experience things, right, and we get through them and we know how to cope, it's easier to understand and relate to others.
Mm-hmm. Oh, that was it? Did you want to add something else, or I think I see you freeze on the screen, Jared. Okay, we'll come back to you because I know you said I thought you had something else. Oh, that was it? Okay, yeah. So, like I was saying, that's called post-traumatic post-traumatic growth. What happens is a lot of individuals are able to learn how to process. We don't necessarily get over it. Kind of redefine that perspective. Kind of think about, all right, how do we build our resiliency to be able to process that and still move forward, and with that, help other people as part of that post-traumatic growth. Anais, hey.
I was gonna say that for people that are in the profession where they have to deal with trauma and crisis, frequently self-care is really important, whatever that looks like to you, and it's different for different people. But I think that on the same vein of how they channeled their traumatic experiences back into the work that they did, I think for some people it also highlights possible triggers, right? So it delineates limits that they have. So one of the things that I think goes hand in hand with self-care is recognizing yourself, right? And what self means. Your lived experience informs your practice and how you show up in every space of the world. So as a professional, for example, the police officer, he very well could state, police officers don't really have a choice, more so than clinicians do. But if she was a clinician, she could say, I don't want to work with survivors of domestic abuse because she wouldn't be able to define or separate herself from it. It could be triggering and it could affect how effective she is in helping another survivor. And I think that sometimes certain people look at that as a default. I think there's a strength because she was able to recognize, because of what I went through, even though I'm healed, I don't want to revisit that in other people. And I can't control that one-off event that might bring me back to that space, and I won't be effective as a clinician to this client. So I need to not work with that population. Some people have the ability to be very resilient and use that, like she did, in training other officers to recognize and humanize people that are going through things that she is not considered. So she saw herself, the human aspect of her. She has a uniform, but she is somebody who has a mental health diagnosis. So he was able to use it in stride to train other officers and then humanize the people that she came in contact with, because she now knows firsthand how that feels. But I think that it's important for us to be able to recognize our limits as people who could very well have survived some of the things that our clients have survived, right? So it's okay to pour into yourself by not causing yourself damage, right? We want to be helpful, but you're not helpful if you're not effective. And if you're traumatizing yourself by putting yourself at in the front line of working with a population that triggers you every day, you're not really effective after. You end up burning out. and it ends up doing more harm than it does good. So I think it's important for us that work with the population, or because trauma affects everybody in different ways. You just said about COVID-19 affected the whole entire world. So everybody now has experienced trauma in some way, shape, or form. So it's important for us to recognize the limits that we have. And it's okay to say no, and draw that line for self-preservation.
Thank you, Anais. Appreciate that. Where you went through a few different places. One of the things I want to mention, just to kind of piggyback on what you're saying, when someone is going through, is being traumatically affected, you're not necessarily aware what your capacity is. And not everybody's going to immediately go get help. Sometimes for some folks, maybe they need to, for some folks, they might need to build their own awareness of how they react and how they respond in different situations. I'm going to refer now to Officer Tully and how she saw herself and how she could not go back to work. But that's not necessarily an awareness that comes to everybody every time. And then there you have some people that say you have a victim of some domestic violence or partner violence, and that person actually is no longer in that physical situation. Just because they're not in a physical situation doesn't mean that another relationship will be the same. Another relationship is going to be physically abusive. Maybe the next relationship ends up being very caring and loving, but it still triggers things. So it doesn't have to be the exact same situation. If an individual can't work with someone else who has the same, they can see that they don't have the capacity to work with certain types of clients or patients, you're likely not able to work with anybody at that moment. You'll likely need to probably deal with some own self-care, self-treatment, whatever that means, and depending on the willingness of the individual, because no one's forced to get any of this help. It really depends on the individual and other dynamics and resources available and so on and so on. Even for the mental health specialist like Officer Morales, like it's the impact, the constant memories, the reliving it. And it's very hard, was very hard for her. She wanted the distraction of her job. It took a while before she finally got treatment. And she finally, took the time she needed for herself. And I don't know if anybody ever completely heals. I think people heal, can get better, but those imprints are always there. That experience doesn't go anywhere. Your brain is specifically designed to remember everything you've ever been through, everything you've ever heard. Unfortunately, with trauma, it doesn't necessarily get caught up in the subconscious, tends to be more conscious, and triggers, if when it does get forgotten, when someone can get better with it, sometimes triggers will kind of bring up the scenario, maybe flashbacks for some, depending where they're at in their situation. Maybe it's just a memory. For some people, they go through the intense feelings again. And so it kind of just depends on, from our perspective as us providers, what I'm encouraging us for us to consider is, how do we start to understand how some of those things, think about our setting, think about the different people we work with. What are the things that we are intentionally doing for ourselves in terms of how do we respond to them, how do we engage, the spaces we engage them in, how do we interact with these folks, even before we learn about whether or not they had trauma issues. And by the way, just because you go through 100 tons of paperwork going into your programs in the beginning, chances are you're going to learn a lot more 90 days later than you will in the beginning. So also understand that when things come up, it's about being trauma-informed all the time. Eula, go ahead.
Yeah, I was going to talk about an experience that I had of countertransference, because I was talking with a patient, I was doing an intake, and she started to describe some of the things that had happened to her in her life, and I almost started crying with her, because it just touched me so hard. It's like you said, that doesn't go away. It stays with you.
Okay. So So what did you do that in that situation? How did you do? How did you cope with that?
I had to excuse myself so I could go to the bathroom and cry, and then come back and pick myself up, and finish the intake. And then I had a session with my supervisor immediately after that.
Absolutely fantastic.
Yeah.
So cool that you took advantage of what the resources you had. You know, you actually gave yourself permission to feel, and you stepped away. Stepping back is not a weak thing. Stepping back is a helpful, healthy thing to do, especially since you're there for somebody else. And again, I'm going to go back to what I said at the beginning. First, it's your wellness that counts first, because if you're not objective, you're not in a healthy state of mind, how are you going to help anybody else? You can exacerbate a situation with someone else if you're not in the most objective, or at least the most grounded place that you can be. You know, that can look different on any given day depending on what issues are happening, you know, what your world looks like. Okay, so let me see how we go. So here we talked about vicarious trauma. There's a great training called Wiped Out and Still Going, Preventing Compassion Fatigue. And I call it a great training because I created it, and I'm presenting it December 8th in case you're interested. So that's my plugin. But it really is about self-care. I was doing something recently in Syracuse, and it was saying it always begins and ends with you. Always. And, you know, the focus of our work is always the other individual. And because of that, that's why you have to take care of yourself. If nothing else, if no other reason, if you're going to take care of them, then you got to make sure that you're in good health, physical, emotional, spiritual, as best as you can. Considering the lay of the land these days, it's really about what you can do to the best of your ability. You have daily challenges, and I understand that, but you're more equipped than most of the other folks that you're working, that you provide services to. So you come first, and then you can help someone else get on that same, learn about how they can get well too. So let me just go back to some of the things that, let's see, that was mentioned. So vicarious trauma. So who's affected? Everybody's affected. Here in the criminal justice system, in terms of people who are affected, you have first responders, law enforcement officers, behavioral health providers. This is where you folks come in. But a lot of you folks also engage with individuals in the criminal justice system. And so everyone can be affected. So impact on work product, it affects your behaviors, it affects your decision making. It can affect your sense of awareness, your level of awareness. And so that can that can consequently influence the relationships, the interactions you have with colleagues, with support groups, with friends, with family. So, and with the different client and patients that you work with. So your own personal values can be impacted, your job performance can be impacted. So traumatic events experienced as threatening, terrifying, or overwhelming, very much like I was saying earlier. And it's pervasive. I mean, there's no such thing as how to indicate that this one person has an issue and the other person doesn't. You folks talked about it shapes your worldview. Here we have that here. And that worldview, the way it's affected, when that's affected, it affects anything else you say and do. And so what is trauma? It's about a situation and an experience, and how you interpret that experience and how it can have long-lasting effects. It can be past to present. It can be typically it's threatening, it's fear-based, it's dangerous, you know, or some recurrence of heightened that puts you in a heightened state. I'm going to use Francisco's words, and it's very much individualized. When we talk about vicarious trauma, you know, if we are in as healthy of a place as we can be, we're in a better position to be able to recognize potential trauma behavior with someone else and act accordingly to be preventive and not to re-traumatize anybody, and to be able to de-escalate and to be able to provide them the supports that they need. So the trauma effects, I'm going to talk about that I'm going to ask you to talk about that when we come back, not just yet. Are there any comments or questions extra that you want to add? Yes, Elisa. Hi, good morning.
Hi, good morning. So there was something I was thinking about as professionals, when somebody had said that she stepped out of the room and had a cry. And I think that, taking care of ourselves is so essential. But, sometimes I'm sitting in and I'm interviewing somebody and they're telling me something which I feel is very traumatic, and they're doing it in a flat voice, in, how you understand why they would be doing that. And so sometimes I'll say to them, I said, I'm feeling a lot of emotion right now, and I understand that you aren't. And one of us in this room is going to feel the emotion of your story. And if you're choosing not to do it right now, I need to let you know that it is impacting me. Because if I sit there and I ignore my feelings, and I'm not saying that the woman who stepped out was ignoring her feelings. I don't want to give that impression. I think that's really good self-care. But like sometimes if I ignore what I'm feeling when somebody's telling me about a trauma of theirs, like I'm doing myself a disservice, and I'm also doing the client a disservice, because I want to let them recognize that, hey, something horrible happened to you. I'm feeling that story. And also, we're going to be talking about the criminal justice system, but I work in the courts, in diversion courts, and their judges don't have the training that a lot of behavioral specialists do, and which I don't have a law degree. So it's they teach me and I teach them, but sometimes I'll have to say to the judge, maybe we could stop talking about this subject with the participant right now, because they're frozen. But I don't want to say that, just say, why don't we talk about, why don't we move on to something else, and then Sue, the coordinator, can talk, because that person is in absolute frozen mode, and they cannot get beyond their trauma, but the judge doesn't recognize it. And because I'm sitting here feeling all of this stuff, I'm like, okay, something's happening, let's move on, and we'll address her later in a safe place. So I just wanted to say that, sometimes our reactions, whether we have trauma or not, we can't ignore them, because it's healthy for us to acknowledge them. So I think I'm done sharing. Thank you.
Thank you, Elisa. During the holiday time, especially, not only do we see an influx of increase in substance use and increase in so many different situations when that's trauma related, and our work gets even more abundant or overwhelming, but we're also feeling like towards the end of the year is around this time, and it builds, it's cumulative, and so even though we still want to keep working, or we still have to keep working, it really helps to know that if you're going to take days off, or you're going to take care of yourself, it's essential to do it. And so we'll talk about that more specifically in that course. But in terms of kind of being able to be more trauma informed, the healthier you are, the better you're able to see how to support and help someone else. Now, Lisa said, shares strategies, Eula shares strategies, Jared shares strategies, Francisco. So we're going to keep building on that. And we have a couple of more videos, and I have an activity that I'd like you to engage in. So right now, I have 11:19, 11:20. I am going to say, let's take, it's 11:20. So let's come back at 11:35, take a break, go get coffee, tea, stretch out, and we'll see you in 15 minutes. Don't log off. All righty. So I hope you all had a chance to kind of stretch out and debrief a little bit. Coffee, tea. I see Donna has her tea. I maxed out with some coffee because I like the energy boost. All right, folks. So any comments, any things that kind of stood out that kind of stayed with you when we went to break? All right, so this is what we're going to do. I want to go back to a video. I'll play your videos. It's about 10, 11 minutes long. And I'm going to come back and I'll tell you what we'll do afterwards. Oh, hi, Kate. Please unmute. What came up for you?
Hi, how are you?
Good, thank you.
I just have a question that just popped in my mind, so it may not be the right time to answer it, but just wondering, do judges take into consideration that those who stand before them, the defendants, that there is trauma involved in their lives? I mean, does that help in the criminal justice sanctions that are imposed? I mean, do they take that into consideration, or? So like I said, it may not be the appropriate time to discuss that right now because we're about to go into another video.
Oh, no, before we go into the video, I'd be happy to respond and others can respond as well. So I've worked for many, many years with the problem-solving course, which is different from the criminal justice. It's a completely different perspective. Problem-solving courts have more of these behavioral health, the addiction, mental health, and trauma, stress, and all that added to the components of the things they do. The criminal justice system, the other types of criminal courts don't necessarily have that. Every once in a while, there's an initiative to inform before some new law gets enacted. They don't necessarily come across that. I think the biggest benefit comes from what I think we've learned from problem-solving courts is when team members, the team that judge leads, the people they are associated with, it's the DA, it's the defense attorney, it is the case manager, it's the court officials, it's the other people who help those offenders, whoever the offender is, to bring to light some of those issues. And then judges can look at that and see if that can mitigate any kind of options they have. One of the things that they're pretty much restricted at is that when there are certain charges that require certain sanctionings, there's not that much flexibility in how they can incorporate. What opportunities do tend to exist, which I found ever since diversion courts or problem-solving courts came to be, is that there's opportunities to refer folks to a problem-solving court to still be in the criminal justice system, but to allow them to get the behavioral health supports they need. And that's only because those judges are being informed by their team members of the behavioral aspects, the addiction aspects, the psychosocial other issues that may be happening with a particular person. And there's a lot more flexibility in what they can do with a given person there. I think people are more restricted. And from that, I believe that part of that results in having a particular focus on what they tend to see and how they can handle certain situations. There's not necessarily a lot of flexibility, latitude in terms of what they can do for a given person. Sometimes they have those options available, many times they don't. So can they take it into account? They can, to a certain degree. It depends if they're required to act according to certain required sanctions for certain charges an individual is given. Anyone else wants to add? Alyssa, I know you work with the courts too, and I know other folks here work with the courts. Please feel free to add here.
So I've been in the diversion problem-solving courts for about 15, 20 years. And I really have to say that trauma-informed care has changed so much of the judicial approach, because in the beginning, jail sanction was pretty common. You miss you test positive, you miss a drug screen, you don't comply with treatment, you go to jail. And we started learning that that's going to cause more trauma. You could lose a job, but also just having, most people go in for a weekend, they're in isolation. But so the judges are going to these trainings. So the felony court judge, the regional treatment court judge, they're getting all these trainings, but they're not just diversion court judges. They're also regular court judges. So they are taking this to the court. And like you said, they can't always change things, but they do bring that. I can't imagine that they don't bring it, because I haven't been sitting in court with them. But my assumption is that they bring these trainings on trauma-informed care to their normal courts. And I think it makes them more empathetic to understanding. And their hands are tied, but then they can also, yes, our ADAs and our public defenders see these trainings as well, and they see the treatment courts. So it's like a little pebble in a pond, and the ripples just keep going, hopefully into the correctional facilities as well. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you. There was some years ago, the New York State was looking to change the age that an adolescent could be charged. At that time it was for 16, you could be charged with adult offenses. And it didn't take into account at the time. And part of that was because with adolescents knowing that developmentally, person doesn't have a fully developed brain until about 25. And that's in ideal conditions, by the way. So and it's until 25. So we were brought in as the research and training organization to be able to inform criminal court judges about that. And so there are different opportunities to be able to inform criminal justice professionals, and particularly the judge. If you can get the information to the judge, he's the leader of the team. He's the one who makes the decision and how direction, and how you're going to address situational issues that come up, with different offenders, So it's great to have the other team members to be informed, but it's the leader, it's the judge that once he's informed or she's informed, then we have a lot of lady judges, women judges. So once that person is informed, they lead the team in a particular direction and can be influenced. So it is possible. It doesn't always work. Kind of depends, and I'm sorry that's not a very, very good response, but Alyssa did a great job about giving you a lot of different, a lot more information about what the potential is there, Okay, so what I'm going to do is I am going to show you a video, and then then we'll come back and I'm going to ask us to do something with the video. So let's look at how some people can be affected by trauma.
I felt so trapped and so alone. I felt so ashamed, and I grew up with this saying, you made your bed and you've got to lie in it. And so I kept telling myself, well, I made my bed, here I am, now I've got to lie in it. And this is my lot in life. This is what I got myself into, and there's no way out.
I kind of thought it for years that it was my fault that I was that way. Maybe I looked at the guy that molested me, maybe I smiled at him too much when I would be at my friend's house.
I feel responsible a lot for my mom being angry at us when we were kids. Sometimes I'll say, if I just had been a little bit quieter, maybe, she wouldn't have beat us.
I didn't care about myself then. Like, I had no self-worth, no self-esteem. Back then I didn't care if I lived or died, because I didn't see the value in me. Like, I didn't feel worthy of anything, any love, or I just didn't feel like I was important.
It stems from that core belief that's put into you that you're not good enough, that you don't count, that something is inherently wrong with you, and therefore you're not qualified to deal with whatever's going on.
I had a hard time sleeping. I always startled really easily, and I'd wake up really easy, and I'd wake up afraid with an adrenaline rush. So I had a hard time getting asleep and staying asleep, and I still have occasional nightmares.
I always keep the television on because of the fear of darkness and the fear of sound. I'm still not ready yet to turn that television off at night. I need to, when I open my eyes, I don't care when it is, I need to see. And I'm never in a full sleep ever, because I'm always in ready mode. I'm always in fight mode.
Walking in big crowds like at the airport or in the metro system, stick close to the wall so that people won't touch me.
I have to be really careful where I'm at, what I do, how I sit. I don't sit with my back to the door. When I'm in a store, a grocery store, and someone has come up behind me and they get into my space where they're really close, I have turned around and punched them or pushed them physically, and dared them to hit me back in some way. I don't care how big they were. I don't care if I get to pulp beat out of me. The issue was, don't get in my space.
If you say anything to me, there is something that I gotta sit back and watch. I really can't trust you no further than I can actually spit because of all the hurt and the trauma that I dealt with throughout my life.
At times it's really hard to trust people just because I know that, well, from experience growing up, people aren't always there. They betray you. They hurt you.
I had a hard time sitting, and still do, with my back to a door. It makes me really uncomfortable because I don't want somebody to walk up behind me. I feel like somebody's gonna come up behind me and do something.
The transition back in the community after coming out of prison was kind of rough because of the paranoia, for one thing. And like I say, you always think, because you got to stay on guard in prison. I don't care how tough you are, you know, you have to stay on guard. And when I came home, it was just, I thought everybody was out to get me.
Fear dictated everything that I did. I always wear several pair of socks, and I always have shoes on from the time I wake up to the time I go to sleep. And it's a preparedness, you know. They'll say, why don't you ever take your shoes off and relax? Because you have to be ready.
I have flashbacks all the time. And that's one of the major things that I'm still working on today, because some of the things is just too real, even today. And that would happen 35, 40 years ago. And yet I can still see it right now before my very eyes. I can see it. Sometimes it messes me up so bad.
Panic attacks. I couldn't catch my breath. I had rapid heart rates and sweaty palms. Sometimes just seeing a place or seeing a person or seeing an incident or smelling something could bring on that panic attack because all of a sudden the memories come flooding through.
Some of these things I still experience on a day-to-day basis. The numbness, the memories, unexpected triggers, you know, sights, smells and sounds. For me, panic attack is, of course, all the things that people typically describe. Heart racing, short breath, feel like you're gonna die, can't get out of it.
The TV being on is not something I have in my house. It's the TV going on when I'm in another room. Because the TV was always gone on those days that I would be in Oakland Hills with those guys. That's what was playing in the background as they were just having, you know, their way with me.
Sometimes somebody can be just walking past me and I'll flinch and jump back and they'll be wondering, what the heck is wrong with you? You know, but they don't realize what's going on inside my head.
It's hard to explain when you drift away and then come back. I just know I could be talking and then the next thing I know, I'm just in another lane.
Like I can probably go through half of my day and not know what happened because I've been somewhere else in my mind, in an alternate, I call it an alternate reality, especially when I'm in situations where I want to remove myself. I can just send myself somewhere else mentally.
I cried if I just thought of anything. I've cried just being lonely. I cried because things didn't come out right. I cried when I just thought about everything that happened in my life. I didn't want to be bothered. Didn't want to go anywhere. It was just work, home, in my room.
I can't untangle from the depression. I can't separate out the depression from substance use. It's all just part of who I am, I guess.
I just wanted to kill myself. I just wanted to die. I figured, well, if I die, I don't have to have another person touching me. And if I die, I don't have to hear something in my head telling me how awful I was and that it was my fault. And if I just die, then maybe the world will be just a little bit better.
With the cutting and the burning and hurting myself, doing what I call self-mutilation, that was connected directly to trauma because I was trying to control internally what I could not control externally. So when I would get triggered or by an incident that happened outside, I would cut because feeling that warm blood, the warmth of it sliding down my arm, for some reason that made me feel alive. I was just angry and fearful and hopeless and helpless, and everything was about me hurting myself. Hurt people, I hurt myself a lot. The thought of being harmed or being in a risky situation, like I didn't have any kind of filter about that like most people would. I also started acting out sexually, and so I was sleeping with older guys. I mean, I was in the 4th grade and I was sleeping with guys that were like in middle school and high school.
High-risk behaviors was really just kind of how I functioned. I was violent. I would take on a man 4 times my size for looking at me wrong in a bar or making a pass at me.
I didn't know what danger was. If somebody had some dope and said, look, come in this alley with 5 strangers, they was like, come on in the alley, we're gonna get high, I would go. That wasn't dangerous to me. I mean, I intentionally sought out people who were gonna hurt me. Going to emergency rooms, beaten up, and the emergency room nurse looking at you, you back? How you raped again? Wasn't you just here a couple months ago saying you had been raped? Because I didn't know the warning signs, and I would put myself in harm's way.
I am very hypervigilant. So hypervigilant, what that means for me is that I'm always paying attention to everything around, and it gets tiring. And I think for me, heroin just relaxed that place in me that is always wanting to, get into something, do something, be something. And so I could just be with what is, always wanting to beat somebody up or prove something to someone. The drugs really help calm that.
When I was on weed, everything was all right in the world. Everything could be falling down around me, but everything was okay. I was cool. I was mellowed out, All my problems seemed to go away, at least until the highs started going down. That's when the reality started coming back. But I just medicate myself with more weed.
Everybody betrayed me. I just felt like if I drink, I'll drink it all gone.
Okay. So remember everything you heard, and I'm going to ask you guys to go into groups. And you have on your activity page, right? It says page 3, trauma effects. So the instructions do include to think about certain things, and I'm going to read these out. What were you observing when these folks were experiencing the effects? What do you think it would look like? What might be behavioral manifestations in terms of your experience in the client community that you work with? How does substance use play a role in a person's life? And then I really want you to, so these are different things to think about. There's a little bit more there, but you don't have to read all. The 4 questions in the box on that page, on page 3, what are the behavioral manifestations that may take place due to the traumatic experiences described? What role does substance misuse play in a person's life? How might these behaviors be problematic from a criminal justice perspective? And just as importantly, how might these behaviors be linked to prior criminal justice involvement? You're going to have 15 minutes. You're going to be in groups of 6. You have 4 questions to respond to. See, do your best to kind of come together. I think it'll be a good opportunity for you folks to talk amongst each other. And so Clyde is going to put this up and put up the link, and you're going to go into groups for 15 minutes. We'll come back in a larger group and process out. So you all have your handouts with you, right? At least one person in the group should have it, and you can read off the 4 questions, have a reporter in there. So work together as a group to respond to the 4 questions in the box. Hey, everyone. Thank you. Welcome back. And thank you for going to the groups. I always think this is so valuable when you're able to discuss with other folks who are doing the same thing you're doing, and kind of share back ideas and strategies. So I'm not going to process group by group. That would be very unrealistic. But anyone who wants to speak to, I'd like to ask, what did you come up with for the first question? What behavioral manifestations may take place due to the traumatic experiences described? And share one thing that you came up with, and other people and other groups and other people can share one other thing that hasn't been mentioned. So who wants to respond to that question?
So we have a lot of stuff here.
Okay. Yeah. All right, Veronica.
I'm sorry.
One thing.
Yes.
Yeah.
Oh, so disassociation.
Okay. Do you want to elaborate on that?
So basically, some of the people that were being interviewed talked about being in an altered state, so to speak. One said, if something is happening around her, she leaves and she goes away. Or one, I don't know if it's the same person, she said sometimes she loses days because she's off in another space, another realm of herself. Yeah.
Right. Excellent. Thank you, Veronica.
You're welcome.
Miguel?
Yeah, so many of them, like one of them will be low self-esteem.
Okay. And how did they speak about that?
I mean, low self-esteem, it takes them to self-blame. They blame themselves for a lot of things that were occurring in their lives, feel like one of them wanted to die. She thought that dying was better than living. So there's so much things.
Well, when you said that, I know that she added that people would be better off without her.
Right.
So yeah.
Yeah.
So self-esteem, internalized guilt for the situations that actually happen to them, and there's a lot of that happens when people are traumatized. Thank you, Miguel. Anyone else wants to add to another suggestion, another response you came up with for that first question? Emily.
We were talking about becoming constantly paranoid and maybe like avoiding crowded spaces, always having your one eye open. One lady said that she barely gets any deep sleep because she's constantly in a state of arousal.
Yeah, and which we already know that's not healthy. You can't.
Yeah.
The sympathetic nervous system and the parasympathetic nervous system are constantly working towards each other. People freeze, or the sympathetic nervous system is overstimulated. People stay at their high tense, high stress level for a long time. Thank you, Emily. Katriana.
We talked about the hypervigilance, it's kind of like what she was talking about. And then, we talked a little bit about depression and some of the mental health symptoms that come along with the trauma.
Yeah. Okay. And so this is a really, really interesting. There's so many things that they had talked about that was very, very, very indicative of the impact of trauma in their lives. Thank you. Timothy.
Hi, one thing we talked about was also a sense of space, like how and where people stand. Like the woman didn't want her back to the door, or don't get too close to my physical space. And so a lot of the men I work with, that's actually true. Some of them don't care if we close the door when we're talking. Some want it cracked no matter what we're doing. And so I think it creates that sense of safety. As long as I can move and I'm not stuck, I'm okay. And that's true of many, many, many people in multiple forms, in my opinion.
There was a project I was working in. I had to interview clients from a particular a pilot program, and they were folks who were mandated from the criminal justice system. And one of the things that we became aware of being trauma informed is to ask permission about closing the door, because sometimes when you automatically do it, that triggers things. Maybe a counselor might need to do it, or they automatically do it. But I was not a counselor. I was not someone who was familiar, and I didn't want to feel like a threat. So I asked the person themselves, would they be all right? Once they explained the project, and they were given a choice whether or not they wanted to participate. So the reason I asked the person is because part of what happens with someone who's been traumatized is a lack of control. that helplessness. And so being able to provide them with the opportunity to make a choice on their own behalf, have that autonomy, can give even a momentarily a sense of empowerment. It's their choice. It wasn't their choice a lot of times with these situations, and that's something we can consider. And so that can translate in a lot of different ways in our settings as well. So thank you for that. All right, let's go to the second question. Oh, Alyssa, did you want to add to that? Yeah, there you go.
Can you, yeah, sorry about that. Just real quick, it was interesting you were talking about the closing the door and hypervigilance. I used to put myself closer to the door when I was doing direct care, because that was what was taught to me. You know, put yourself closer to the door so that you have a way out if something goes down. Except the sheriff had come by and said to me, no, you need to switch this up. You need to put the client near the door, because if you have the client the farthest away from the door, they may see you like they're threatened. They have no way out. They don't have control. They don't have a sense of agency in that situation because you're in the way. And it was just a very different perspective of, you know, who do I protect? You know, me, or is, so I don't even, I would just ask the client, you know, where would you like to sit? Because I put 2 seats so that I felt like they had agency, and I also, you know, that would reduce some of their anxiety. So it's just interesting that you brought that up. I was thinking about that with the door and chairs and stuff. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Timothy, you wanted to add?
Yeah, so I just want to add one more thing. I agree with what she said, and I work with adult men, and you know, with self-esteem issues anyway, and stereotypes, you know, men don't want to appear weak, so to speak, right? And so if I say, hey, sit where you want, or you want the door open and closed, it totally empowers them, and they don't have to be embarrassed to say, oh, I'm scared to have the door closed, because they won't always say it, even if you know it's true. And so it just it creates instant trust. It's powerful.
Yeah, yeah. A lot of folks who are traumatized, it tends to speak to lack of control, a lack of being able to have as a daily routine, lack of ability to be able to engage people the way perhaps maybe other people do. The lack of capacity to be able to do things that most other people can do. Not having that debilitation piece, that can be very important for us to be able to support that. And we're going to speak to that in a minute. How about the second question? What role does misuse or substance use or misuse play in a person's life, particularly the folks that were sharing on the video? What did you come up with for that? Please raise your hand. Joelle? I don't know if I said it right, but
no worries. It's Jolie, but
Jolie. Okay, thanks.
In our group, I took a little bit of time to mention just that for a variety of people, whether it's depression, traumatic experience, maybe prolonged substance use, I think that your daily or your usual baseline of just energy to kind of go about your day can shift pretty dramatically. And so sometimes substance use is that sort of way to get you to, if you're waking up every day without substance use at 100%, somebody who is using might only wake up at 60% or at 0%. And they may not feel like they have enough energy to go about living their day, or they may not feel happy enough to, just kind of participate in their daily activities and interactions. And so sometimes substance use is that repetitive action of being able to get themselves to that 100% to be able to be an active participant in their life.
Mm-hmm. So can I just say something? I know this is maybe off a little bit, and I was thinking about how caffeine does that to a lot of us, kind of gets us up and going. And so I kind of see a correlation with that, interesting. Thank you for sharing that. Okay, one thing that your group came up with in terms of how substance use or misuse plays a role in a person's life. And so the next person I saw was Francisco, then Brianna, then Jared. Go ahead, Francisco.
Well, what I would like to talk about is I spent I worked 8 years as a KSAT, part of my career, and to be honest with you, now with the over a decade in trauma work since that time, I I've switched from, or I begin to look at the addiction model differently than how they look at it as a medical disease. I'm really starting to see how addiction and things such of that nature are a byproduct of a traumatic event that occurred in a person's life at some time. And it then begins to manifest as substance use, which is a coping mechanism and just a way to block out one of those people in the film mentioned how it just causes her not to even think about it anymore, right? The event.
Okay, so thank you.
That was
So as a coping mechanism to deal or maybe not to deal. Brianna.
So we talked about the relief it gives from whatever the experience is, or and keeping thoughts at bay. So kind of like a relief and break from whatever's happening in that person's life.
So thinking about like the symptoms that trauma can have on people, like the restlessness or the high intensity or maybe extra depression, things like that.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Because we know a lot. They shared it, and we already have that experience as providers with a lot of our clients in our communities that we provide services to. And so sometimes to articulate might be a little difficult, but I know you know it. Robert, what would you like to add? How would you respond to that question? How do you see substance use playing in their life?
Well, by the way, the name I know it says Robert, but I'm Bob, and I like to go by Bob too.
Oh, sure.
Okay,
Then I'm going to change your name to put it to
group,
Bob.
all right. Our group kind of talked a little bit about the interrelationship of all four questions, almost like a cascade. If people don't feel good about themselves, if they're depressed, they often turn to substances and they feel much better. But as we all know, substances sometimes lead to addiction, and addiction can be expensive. So people who are addicted, regardless of the substance, oftentimes end up in legal trouble because they steal to afford it, or the substance itself is illegal, and so they end up in the criminal justice system. Shoplifting is a great example. And if you read the police logs, you find that people don't have one shoplifting offense. Oftentimes it's fifth offense, sixth offense, 10th offense, because that's how they afford their addiction. So it's almost like a cascade. I don't feel good. I use substances to feel better. I can't afford it, so I steal and ultimately end up in the legal system. Okay?
Thank you, Bob. Okay.
The answer that.
Okay. Okay. So it can be a cascade for some. It's just that's not always that linear for everyone. I just want to make sure that we understand that this is a very individualized process. But thank you for that. Now that Bob got us into the other questions, how did you respond to how the behaviors that you saw, that you heard these folks talk to, how is that problematic from the criminal justice perspective, particularly if these behaviors are linked to prior involvement in the system? How did you folks respond to the last two questions? So how might these behaviors be problematic from a criminal justice perspective? And not just directly how they got in jail, a little bit more than that. Go ahead, Kay.
Yes, that's the one that Jared participated with that question. So I appreciated his comment.
Jared, do you want to share now? Okay, tell us. What did you add to, particularly for that question?
Thank you, Kay. In that question, we talked about how the workers in the criminal justice system might have been overwhelmed with a lot of work and not basically knowing who has underlying issues for us, trauma, co-occurring disorders, and how they may have been dealing with their own issues and having to get home to work, get home to their wife, have children, maybe personal illnesses or whatever, and with not, it's a form of neglect. When it comes to making a decision about someone that you don't know everything about, and then you just make a decision, right? They're going to be thrown in jail. This person's going to get probation. This person is going to be allowed to go home. Without knowing all the underlying issues, how could you judge a person and all the information is not being gathered, the empirical evidence? But some people, like I said, in the criminal justice system, they just push the pen, and that's the issue.
Thank you, Jared. That's such a good point. And I'm going to come back to you, but I do have another hand up, and I'm going to come back to that and make a point of that and just kind of add to what you said. So thank you for that. So Kay, thank you for bringing him back to my attention. Laura, please unmute.
So I worked as a clinic social worker, and one of the biggest things that I worked with was opiate misuse. And I would have patients that, and someone kind of made this comment earlier, that the only way that they could get up in the morning was by taking the substance or taking their opiate. And so it was something that they had to have all the time, and it became a coping skill for them. We tried like other interventions. I even tried trying to get them into a treatment facility, but not being willing to participate was probably the biggest thing that I saw in my patients. And sometimes I would give them all the resources that they would need. And sometimes there was that time that I took the extra time of calling those facilities for them, to see if they had any rooms or see if it would be something that would work for them. But then again, it all came down to participation.
Thank you, Laura. So what are some of the challenges that you mentioned with opioids? The physical dependence, give them a hard way to go, because not having to feel normal because of physical dependence is not just, it's not just the psychological part. It's not just a neurological process are rewired. It's also that the physical dependence is there. So when the body doesn't have it, and to avoid going into those withdrawals and all that, a person may want to kind of get normal or whatever normal feels in their life with substance. And sometimes some people are not willing to go through that stress and that extra taxing, painful process to either get clean or even to get admitted into say a medication for opioid use disorder type of treatment. But I totally understand what you're saying in terms of being able to try to connect them to potential treatment options for folks who use opioids. I also think as a coping mechanism, you mentioned it, which is such a good point, is about, if that's mitigating any kind of trauma symptoms, why wouldn't they want to continue to do that? If they found a way to actually cope in their world and take care of the responsibilities with that and still kind of keep those symptomatic aspects of trauma at bay, it's the coping mechanisms, not necessarily the healthiest, but not for nothing. If we look at it from this side, it's resourceful. It's resourceful. It says a lot about they're working with what they know and they're using it and still trying to achieve certain things. The thing is that a lot of people don't really realize that, kind of like what Bob was saying earlier, is that, and some folks, and Katie put in the chat box, when somebody starts to mitigate traumatic symptoms with substance use, kind of might get caught up in the addiction, might meet the criteria of substance use disorder, and depending how your world looks like, it can really go in so many different ways. So even though we're going through this content today, in a very templated way, there's so many, and thank you, Laura, for bringing that up, but there's so many other influencing factors for any given individual. It's not templated. We're just kind of walking through this content, but there's a lot of other influences, other, things that push and pull people in different ways, and things that are happening in a person's world, which is completely different from the next person. So thank you for that. Anyone else want to add to how these behaviors are linked to prior criminal justice involvement. And I thought that was a really good question. I understand it in a particular way. How did you folks understand it? How did you respond to that? How might these behaviors be linked to prior criminal justice involvement? Eula, go ahead.
They learned it in jail. They learned how to act this way. They learned all the tricks of the trade. Going back and forth to jail, they learn how to speak, they learn how to act, they learn what's going to keep them in jail, what's going to get them out of jail. They teach each other.
Well, one of the gentlemen, I'm gonna work with what you said. I'm gonna kind of reframe a little bit. If are you okay with that? Yeah, okay, good. So I kind of just want to say from like one of the gentlemen was talking about, his name was Thomas, surviving. And Thomas and the general another Orby, which was the gentleman that was crying. These two gentlemen were talking about in the criminal justice system how they survived in it. And so a little different, just think about the cascade that Bob, suggested to us. And think about how someone behavior turns into being violent and substance use becomes part of it. And they end up in a criminal justice system. And that criminal justice system, when it's not informed, can exacerbate situations. And for a person to survive, not in jail, I'm talking about prison. When you have to survive in prison, because there's a whole culture that goes on in there. It has nothing to do with the outside world, and it's got the COs are not necessarily in charge. There's a whole culture in there with the prison population. In order to survive that, folks have to kind of adapt so they can survive. And when that is done for a long period of time, just like anything else, when we do something a long period of time, we call them habits. But deep-rooted conditioning alongside a lot of the traumatic situations that a lot of people have experienced and bring with them, that starts to get more concretized within the individual. So this criminal justice system does not necessarily help. It can very much exacerbate. Just even going through the system, getting arrested, going through the different processes. Don't even want to touch about anything about how law enforcement engages with the community. Just going through those processes are traumatic and can build upon all the other trauma that the individuals already experienced. Alyssa, go ahead.
The other day, my husband and I were watching a television program, and there was this person who was 18 years into a life sentence, and it was for a crime he kept saying he didn't commit. But there was a prison riot, and he ended up stomping a guard. And the fact of the matter is, who he was when he went in. I don't know if this is television, but it was just very who he was. If you looked at a photo of him when he went in at 18. And to who he was now, he wasn't 18 at the time, but 18 years later, prison made him into a different person because of how he had to survive. And so his reaction of violence had everything to do with not who he was before he was in prison, but the trauma of prison created this person who violently acted out. And even though they were able to find out he wasn't really guilty of the first crime, he was still guilty of the second crime. And you can't, you still have to take into consideration the fact that he hurt a guard. But it was interesting that this TV program was talking exactly about what you're talking about in the trauma of prison and how it affects people in the culture. He's like, this is not who I am. This is who I had to become.
Yeah. And it's interesting because the movie that you were speaking to, the first thing that comes to my mind, I said, well, that would have never happened had you not been put in a position. So let's flip this on the criminal justice system. So let's go that way, But then that's just my head. That's how I'm going to.
We're in the same place,
well,
same page.
If you didn't put me there, that would not have happened. So where's your part? You're accountable, before I am. But offenders don't have a lot of rights. Offenders do not have a lot of resources afforded. What they do have is when they do come out of the criminal justice system, or even when they're there, when they're connected to you, they have you. This is not something they typically have. Okay, so whether it's criminal justice, whether problem-solving course, whether people coming out and trying to learn to integrate back into the community. You heard Thomas talk about, that was tough for him. It was tough. He thought everybody was out to get him all the time. It's a mindset. Just because where there is a person leaving, and this is what Jared said before, and I just remembered what I was going to say is when we want to think about how law enforcement also is overwhelmed and how they don't necessarily respond. May react more than they respond to an individual who may have a trauma behavior situation at the moment. It's like people who come back from. It's like folks like you. You are constantly going through things. You are overwhelmed with a lot of different things. You are empathetic and you are dealing with a lot of traumatic different situations with different clients. And you may not be in the healthiest place or be informed on how you can engage individuals to even take a moment to say, wait a minute, maybe there's a mental health issue. Law enforcement is not trained like that. They're trained like the military. They're trained to be able to react without thinking for safety reasons for the community, for themselves, and so on. And that aspect of that training doesn't always include trauma-informed approaches. So thank you for mentioning that, Jared. Thank you. So Joshua, hi, haven't heard from you. Please.
Hi. First, can I get clarity on that question? I mean, I've been hearing pieces of it. I'm just not really clear on the exact question.
How might these behaviors be linked to prior criminal justice system involvement? Is that the question?
Yeah, the last one. Yeah, that one. So the behaviors. So what type of behaviors are we talking about?
We are talking about behaviors that are actually trauma-based but exacerbated by being involved with the criminal justice system.
Yeah, and so I'm going to speak as one who is we like to call it justice impacted, right? But I was formerly incarcerated for 20 years. And so I was released in 2011. And so I've been home now almost, it's 12 and a half years and no contact with law enforcement. You know, I came home with a life parole and I was released from parole in 3 years off of life and got a passport and traveled the world, right? Because something that I wanted to do. But while I was incarcerated, did the 20 years, I never had a fight. I never had a fight. I never had an infraction. I never had an issue. I was in honor block in Sing Sing for 11 years, honor block in Elmira for 2.5 years, honor block in Fishkill Correctional Facility for about 6 years. So I did all of the 20 years without getting into any problems. Every person who's incarcerated is not the same. The criminal justice system, the mass incarceration does not help people to rehabilitate themselves. You have to do that on your own, and you have to be strong to do that on your own. One of the ways how it impacted me personally was that when I was out in the street and I was a teenager, I'm 53 now. So when I was a teenager, I came out of the DFY, Division for Youth programs. I got in trouble doing a little stealing when I was like 14, 15, went to a Division for Youth, is kind of jail, right, for about a year. And so when I came home around 1986, the crack epidemic had hit America, and that was the thing to do. You didn't have to steal anymore, just transfer over into being a crack dealer or a drug dealer. And so most of the youth in my time, they were not stealing anymore. They wanted to be crack dealers because they didn't have to harm anyone or steal. So it was sort of a justification to continue in crime, right? And still get money and not have to go out and get a job and those other things, right? But one of the things were eventually, they had to crack down and people went to jail and I went to jail as well. When I found myself in one of the county jails, I did get beat up by some of the corrections officers because I didn't understand jail and I didn't understand the system. And at the time, it was an overcrowding system, and pretty much I was asking questions that I shouldn't have asked, which is there are some cells that were not overcrowded, and there was others that they were crowding people into. And when I asked that question, could I go into a cell that wasn't crowded? I got beat up, and I think that really did something in me. Because when I was released, I was bailed out. I had a personal problem with another individual. We had the street beefs, and that trauma, not only with the fact that I was beaten like beyond, but also the fact that I was a marijuana user, and smoking marijuana. There's a paranoid effect that comes with smoking marijuana. So with the paranoid effect that comes with marijuana, with being beaten by the corrections officers, that created like this really aggression in me, with my past upbringing, being beat by my parents, because back then Black families, they don't spare. They had the biblical scripture that says, "Spare the rod, spoil the child." And my family did not spare the rod. They used brooms, bats, sticks, wires, whatever, to make sure that we were in check. So with my trauma from family, with trauma from being incarcerated, with trauma from the peer pressure in the streets and all those different things, and then the smoking of the marijuana and having a problem in the street with an individual, led me to being paranoid enough to shoot. And that caused the fatal loss of life, if I can use it in that sense. And so I actually had to do 20 years for that. But in my 20 years, I actually wind up getting a master's degree on my own while I was incarcerated in theological studies. And then I came home and I got a master's degree in mental health counseling. I got a permit from the New York State Educational Department, Office of Professional Discipline, to practice private practice of mental health, and also a master case act. And so I'm clinical director here now with Exodus Transitional Community after being home for so long and making so much progress. And my story is not everyone's story. And although there are a lot of stories like mine, especially here at Exodus, there are a lot of stories that unfortunately didn't end well. Whether they were in prison, because I was there when many men have actually killed themselves through hanging up, while they were in prison. Most of the time on holiday time and Christmas, those times, Thanksgiving, they would hang themselves and kill themselves. And some had less time than me, 3 years, 5 years, 10 years. And then other killings, inmate on inmate or convict on convict, with knives and different types of instruments. So it was not always well. And yes, the majority of the people, well, I would say half, they do succumb to the degenerate life of prison, whereas there's homosexuality, there is gangs, mostly gangs, a lot of racism, right? Doesn't matter. You're Black, Spanish, you're white, you're whatever. It's the total division inside there, and everybody takes a corner, takes a group, right? Even religious groups, Muslim groups, 5% of groups, Christian groups. And so everybody takes a corner. I was with the Christians. And so, and so depending on who you are, there's trauma that comes from that, because whoever you're with, you have to protect them as well as they're protecting you. So you don't have to do anything to end up having to do something to protect someone else. So there's a lot of trauma that comes from that as well. So yes, so prison, if you're not focused, if you haven't made your mind up, if you're not with the right group, then there will be no rehabilitation for you. And yes, the trauma cycle of trauma will continue, and it will be deep-seated. And most people who come home from prison after doing extensive time have mental health issues like PTSD and depression, anxiety, and so many others, ADHD, so many others, and are not able to work, are not able to start their lives over, and are very fearful of coming back out and being in society, because society has moved on and progressed. And when I came home, I didn't know how to use a cell phone, because cell phones didn't exist, when I was out in the street. So I had to ask somebody to help me to use the phone, because I don't know how. What is this? I didn't know how to turn it on. Computers, any type of technology, life moves on. And people who come from prison don't know how to use the technology, and they're afraid. And sometimes that could lead to trauma that will cause them to commit another crime to go back. I have people that tell me that they felt safer in prison than they do out here. And sometimes I have to talk them down out of committing a crime to go back to prison, because it's less stressful. And so yeah, everyone is not like me. Even though I can cite a lot of hundreds of people like me that are here, that are doing the right thing. But there are a lot of people who are not like me, and unfortunately will fall victim to the system or to something harsh again, in a short period of time. So I don't know if that answers your question, or if you were having any questions for me.
No, it answers the question how it affected you personally. Thank you so much for sharing a view. And thank you for post-traumatic growth and a lot of other things, taking all that and and giving back into the community and being and moving on from that without letting it anchor you down in place. You had resources and capacities to be able to do that. And exactly what you said is part of how we started this. Is not everybody's the same. Not everybody's the same. Not everybody has the resources, opportunities, the way they think, maybe other supports. Thank you so much for what you do. And thank you for sharing that. So that really speaks to why I needed to mention, like, I know this seems like a templated content that I'm presenting here. And this is how the games folk put this together, but there's so many other mitigating factors that can help that situation be more positive or exacerbate for an individual, or maybe they can come out of it. Or find a way to adjust and actually grow and have a quality life in spite of. Deborah, you have your hand up. Let me see if I could help you unmute. There you go. Press the button. There you go.
So I had a comment to him saying it was frustrating about them when they come out of prison and going back. So I'm in North Carolina, and I just come back from a North Carolina, it's NCJSA, it's like juvenile, because I work with juveniles. But we did a reenactment, and I mean, it's not the same thing, but it's kind of like it gave you a look into a life of people who are trying to get, like, they've been in prison for so many years and they have to go and get all this stuff. And we had like 10 minutes to go from table to table, and we had certain things we had to do to get all this stuff done. And I'm going to tell you, it was very frustrating because we were playing the part of the person who had been in prison or whatever. And again, like I said, I'm not saying that that's the same thing, but it just kind of gave you a little bit of perspective of what these people dealt with. And I totally understand now why they would get frustrated, because they don't know what they have to do. And that causes trauma all over again. To me, it did anyway. I'm just like, this is ridiculous. And so when he said that just kind of like brought back to my attention about us going through that. And I'm like, I totally understand now why most of them, when they come out, they do something to go back in, because they don't have the resources that they need. They feel like they're alone and they don't have that support coming back out. And it was crazy. It was just crazy.
Thank you, Deborah. And then she's responding to what Joshua shared. And thank you, Joshua, again. So a lot of times, yeah, I've heard that, that folks, people kind of go back to what's familiar with them, or how they can survive in an area or in a way where they can control. And coming back into this world from a completely different world can be very overwhelming for folks. So guys, ideally, that's just a sex story that we want for all our clients, what Joshua shared with us. The thing is, what does success look like on different people? And so really speaking to how we can help support from our perspective, using all this content, all the dialogue, and the experiences that you have yet to share, but a lot of that you have shared. Think about how we as providers can support people wherever they're at, So think about what are some resilient factors that we can acknowledge and recognize in an individual that we can support? Because it can't be just all negative. We understand. We got to understand how it can look like this, it can look like that. The same situation can look very different on any given person. The different aspects of their life can be very different. So, okay. So now that we know that, and that really brings our awareness up. So how do we support resilience? And if we're thinking about resilience in terms of a way to help folks, I don't know, I'm very leery, and as much as I get into the research, I'm very leery of saying that people can recover completely. People can heal. I don't know if there is an end space, a place to get to, but we can certainly help support folks to build resiliency and learn to adjust and kind of live that quality of life, whatever that looks like. So kind of redefining those words in a different way where we can support an individual in their wellness process, potentially. So What are some resilient factors that we want to recognize and support our client community with? What are some things that we have seen that we can help support someone that has helped them? If we're going to look at all this trauma and how trauma can affect people very differently, what is some building resiliency within an individual to help them adjust, to help them process their trauma, to help them be able to move through their day in a way where it's minimally or at least traumatizing. So while they increase their capacity to be able to do that on a regular basis, what can we support? What are the strengths that people bring that they may not necessarily know they have, that we can acknowledge, support them so they can live a quality life in spite of the fact that they've had these trauma issues? And I'm not saying, and I'm not from a treatment clinical perspective, that's for the specialists. For the clinical, I'm saying from the other perspective, how can we support them? We can give a referral to a therapist, that's true. What can we do when we're interacting with them and working with them around their substance use and their other mental health issues? How can we support that resiliency? Go ahead, Kay.
I'm thinking possibly just having positive people in their lives. It could come from within their community, someone that can stand by them as they go day to day, healing from being incarcerated. It could be their family, it could be a pastor, but those positive role models that can keep them encouraged and to know that, to give them hope, to know that that you survived, you're alive. God has brought you to this point, so take it and run with it and move on, move forward.
Thank you. The power of positivity has a lot of research behind it, a lot of research, inspiring that hope and giving folks the opportunity to be empowered. Anything else? I see that Julie put hope, goals, future-oriented support systems. Well, you have the opportunity to be able to access support systems for the individuals, or what a healthy support system might be for them. It may not be their family. Their family may be the number one risk factor sometimes. And so the idea is, what else? What can be important to them? We see clients with very similar issues kind of attract each other, form alliances and friendships. There's a lot of strength in that interpersonal, bonding. It's a lot of strength in that. So I like that Kate mentioned, some maybe faith-based, if that's important to the individual. It could be self-support groups. It can also be what's important to that individual. Think about the 8 dimensions of wellness that SAMHSA suggests to us. Part of that is like community. Do they have connections in the community? Things that they can have goals and to involve them in. The thing about being able to be able to give them supports that is very individualized is very important. Let's see. Support is over 80% related to success in treatment. Thank you, Sheila. Francisco, what did you want to add?
Well, I was thinking what you said earlier, just a little while ago about family, how it's for some, it's such a sensitive topic, right? Because that may be the source of their trauma. But when an individual goes through that, one of the things I have seen is that they may have their perception of family, though, has also built from that. So they got ideas about what a good family member is, right? Their uncle or their father or their mother, whatever, may have treated them in such manner, but it helps them form an idea or an idealized version of what a good father is, or what a good mother is, or what a good brother, sister is. And in that, they find that in other people. That's where the communities, you start meeting with like minds who have this idea about what a good parent is, for example, right?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, very much so. So when we think about resiliency factor, it has a lot to do with that learning what's important to that individual. What Francisco was talking about, I've seen that with different clients I used to work with, where they would engage in a more intimate, safe way with individuals that they couldn't do with their families. Sometimes it's not that the family is a risk factor, it's just that they're not that supportive or informed. And so sometimes they are triggers. And so so it kind of depends. We help some we can help our clients to make decisions around what activities they might engage with a family member or family members and which ones not. And especially when it's tied to substance use. We know what's coming up now. We got Thanksgiving coming up, we got Christmas, we have New Year's. There are a lot of family traditions and observances. And the reality is a lot of it may be tied to some type of substance use, sometimes as other rituals. Is that healthy for the individual? What does the individual want to do? We want to be able to support them in what they may have, and what may be empowering for them. We have a lot of us do work and have colleagues who are peer support specialists. One of the things about their lived experience and is that, or really the approach they use is working with an individual's recovery capital. So that being said, recovery capital from the perspective of your client is what are the resources they have? Where is it that they are in their life in terms of their own traumatic symptoms, in terms of what they want to do, what options have they been offered, what are they willing to do for themselves, who are they connecting with? Is it another support group that has similar symptoms? Maybe we started to understand that when we saw adolescents get caught up with the gang life had a lot to do with that. Like what one of the individuals who spoke on a video, one of the things she said, she had the support and had people having her back. She had all the things that she wasn't getting from her nuclear family. And we see that. And so that can further translate when someone is trying to recover from, say, from their substance use, trying to recover from their trauma, trying to understand what can that look like, what are the resources available, what options can we connect them with. So those are the things those are just a couple of the things that we can elicit from the individual to understand what works for them, what are their strengths, how does that translate. A lot of resourcefulness comes from folks who have been to be traumatized in a lot of the situations these individuals spoke to us about and shared with us, and to be able to survive that, huge. There's a lot of resourcefulness and a lot of strength in that. Being able to provide other ways to cope with different situations that come up is other things that we can do to support them. And that does not necessarily have to be the therapeutic clinical process. But there are things that we can do in terms of how we engage, in terms of when we're doing the wraparound services, when we are facilitating substance use counseling, when we are working in how we engage them, and maybe some past experiences come up, how do we support them? How can we take them not just from what happened to them, from what can they do now, what's working for them now, because it's not enough to just articulate it. And many therapists will let you know that articulation of the situation is key when a person can self-regulate physically, and then they can articulate the situation. But then it's not about leaving them there. It's about how do they go forward? Okay, now what do they do to help themselves? You can't escape every muffler. You cannot escape every radio that triggers that where there's a song that triggers us a thought. So how do we support those coping mechanisms to so a person can work through their day without it kind of getting them stuck in the past again, without re-traumatizing them. And so the resiliency factors, we want to go on that side. We want to find out what that is for every given individual. So let me just come up with some slides here, and let me just good share, man. Employment as maybe, and not just an employment just to get a job, not just to get it. Can it be a meaningful type of employment? Physically, people need start to learn how to take care of themselves and how to start to be aware how their body reacts to different environmental stimuli. Kay had mentioned the faith related supports. So health issues, mental health problems, the risks we've already heard about. I don't want to get into that anymore. What we want to be able to support is some of these aspects that can be very healthy for individuals. We talked about historical trauma, let me go back to here. We want to address the fear of stigma, can't be a victim. We already know that a lot of folks kind of bring them down. I want to go on the side of the positive parts. So individual differences can affect resilience and risk. It's also the current circumstances. One of the things that really stands out when Joshua had mentioned about, when some people come out of prison and they come into this other environment they're unfamiliar with, that can seem overwhelming. And so somebody might want to do crime to go back into that. What we have a lot of times is whether a person is coming back from combat theater, from the military, or coming out of prison, or somebody's intimate partner violence, or even folks who have been dealing with childhood abuse for many years, when they are recluse or they try to stay away from the public, that might be indicative of trauma. Well, we want to understand what their world looks like now, how we can emphasize or help connect them with the supports they need. So it looks very different. And so individualized experiences and response really requires an individualized support. So trauma-informed responses. People need respect, information, safety, choice. I like to put safety first because I think that is so key, and it really correlates with everything else that we do. And respect. Respect is not being rude. It's more than just not being rude. Respect means I hear what you have to say, I listen to information from you, and I take your perspective. The perspective I understand from what you're sharing, and I include that in your recovery or wellness process, whatever, or service plan, whatever it is, the service that I'm trying to give you, your perspectives and your philosophies and your decision-making process, your feedback is included. That's how I define respect. So in terms of avoiding or overreacting or triggering behavior, let me just stop here for a second and let me just see where I'm at here. Because okay, that's good. All right, let me go back. So it's really in the approach that we use. Safe space is both physical and cognitive. And it's really, and work with their autonomy so they can dictate what that looks like for them, and you work with that. The communicators tell what happens next, and it's really about being transparent with individuals, letting them know what the process, what your role is to support them, and what they can expect from the services that they're there to access. And just the tone of voice makes a big difference. The other day I was doing a trauma-informed care upstate, and so one individual was telling me how he didn't realize that his voice actually, triggered a woman who actually put a complaint against him, because to her, he seemed arrogant. To him, he seemed as a provider. He said, "This is how I speak to everybody." I said, "Well, and you can't be perfect all the time, but when you're consciously or intentionally watching that your tone of voice is a certain way because you don't want to trigger anything in anybody, you're more likely than not to be more supportive and and the person feel more trusting or comfortable with you. And so just being mindful of how we speak. Sometimes we're overwhelmed. We have an amazingly crazy schedule on any given day. I know you have a lot of crises that are not planned, and sometimes you have to cover for someone, and then by the end of the week, you have to have a certain amount of certain work done. And so I know it can be overwhelming, because I remember when I was doing a little bit of some aspect of what your jobs were. So we might also want to be mindful of how we seem to come off. So we want to respond, to be patient, be sensitive to, sometimes people act a certain fearful way. Instead of judging, let's find out where that comes from. Active listening, cultural sensitivity, and be flexible with consequences. So I want to do one more video, and I will get your take on it. All right. And so I'm not going to ask for any more responses right now. Everybody okay right now? You good? Good? Okay. Just checking. Just checking.
One day, I was driving home from work, and I went home, got my things. Me and my wife started arguing and whatnot. I left, came back out, got in the car, and I calmed down, and the police pulled me over. I'm like, what did I do now, officer? He said, sir, may I see your driver's license, registration, and insurance card? So I produced it. And that voice hit me. It said, kill, 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 kill. I was like, no, this man didn't do nothing to you. But the officer saw that there was something wrong with me. I was hostile. I was very, very nasty attitude. He kept his composure. If he didn't keep his composure, I think I would have exploded much more than I did. But he kept his composure, and he kept very calm. He told his partner, I got this, because his partner was ready to jump in the car and drag me out. And, I'm like, okay. And he said, sir, please step out of the car. He said, I had a suspended license. I said, suspended license? Why? He didn't know, and I didn't ask, and we just commenced getting the cuffs and handcuffing me and whatnot. So I said, okay, cool in the gang. When his partner started patting me down, I just didn't like that. I just didn't like to be patted down, because it's not so much what he was doing, it's the way he was doing it. Okay? You can pat somebody down without being hostile. This officer did not want to take me into the precinct. He said, I'll take you to we going to Kings County. I said, first of all, I deserve a phone call. I was telling him all my rights and whatnot. And he was like, yeah, okay. You'll get everything you deserve as soon as you see the doctor. I mean, this officer, he was a professional in my book, because he kept his calm. He didn't have to. I mean, I would call him everything under the sun. He would just say, now, Mr. Wrighton, that's not necessary. So he was very composure, and like the doctor came out and spoke to me and asked me what was the matter. I was trying to explain to the doctor, I haven't had my medication. I was tired. I had a fight with my wife. I was going home. This cop once stopped me. No, he was not a cop. He was an officer. I got to give him that. And I was explaining all this to the doctor at Kings County, and he was saying, your explosive behavior, your aggressiveness is all focused on your on your diagnosis. I says, yeah, okay, good. Just tell him. He says, we're going to keep you for a few days. So I says, cool in the gang. I get away from my wife. I get 3 square meals, don't have to worry about work, and don't have to do nothing.
I actually had a really good teacher that believed in me, even though I didn't believe in myself. And even though I was still strung out on drugs and everything, and just a hot mess, she went to court for me and told the judge that I'm not what the things that she sees on paper. I will say that the one thing that was the most helpful in that situation was that judge actually listened to my teacher. Instead of looking at me as a number or a case, she actually paid attention to what my teacher was saying to her about my trauma history and about my potential. She explained to the judge about my dreams. At that point, it was about becoming a nurse. She explained to the judge, like I did, that if I had a felony, that I couldn't go to nursing, that I couldn't become a nurse, I couldn't get my license. And the judge actually listened to that. Like, she realized that at least I may be in trouble right now, but at least I have goals and that I'm thinking ahead, even though my life is a mess. That was helpful. She also paid attention to the fact that my mother was there in the courtroom with me. Now, I know not everyone has family that supports them and that will show up to court with them or whatever, but the judge noticed that my mother was there in the courtroom supporting me on an aggravated promotion of prostitution charge. And usually that's something someone wouldn't want to, be associated with at all. But my mother was there in full support of me. So the judge made a statement that basically said, because I have the support of my mother, that she can see that I may be able to overcome this aspect of my life. Even though that may not have necessarily been true, because she doesn't know my mom could have been the one setting up my appointments for all you know, but at least she acknowledged that part, and she was mindful of who was in court with me, who were my supporters, and there was also a moment where she said she realizes that going through trauma is something that can affect someone's life, and that she hopes that I get the help that I need. And she said that it was going to be important for me to do that in order to be able to have a successful life later on down the road. She said that to me. Even though at the time I was still on drugs and my mind was not in the right place, I remembered that. Like, that stuck out to me, that eventually one of these days I need to get help. I need to go to therapy. I need to get some kind of treatment if I'm going to live a life worth living. That affected me, and that stuck in my head. Like, I remembered those words, and when it was time for me to get my stuff together, I remember her saying that to me, and I was ready for something different, a better life.
So here are these two videos, and what you saw, first of all, I think these people are amazingly courageous, and their articulation of what they went through and their awareness and how they push forward is amazing. And yet we can't necessarily say that all our clients are in that space, but we can certainly help support them on that journey, if you will. So here what you saw with Robert, do you notice how Robert's process, he's aware of his mental health, he's aware of the diagnosis was a PTSD diagnosis. The doctor was telling him when he eventually did get to the hospital, he was able to articulate, he was able to discern between an officer. He said, nah, he's an officer, he's not a cop. And I thought that was really respectful, really nice. But he was able to discern between one individual that seemed to be respectful and actually showed like they cared about him and the way he was engaging him. And he was also aware that the other individual was the other partner officer was hostile and had kind of an attitude. And he was very well aware that if the first officer wasn't as informed the way he was and the way he approached them, he probably would have reacted and it could have turned out pretty badly. So you see the difference with when law enforcement, when providers like ourselves, when other resources that we access in the community for our clients, when they are informed, how it can be an environment that's more supportive than exaggerating a particular issue, a particular trauma issue with folks. And Robert had a lot of issues going on with him because he had just had a fight with the wife. What was it? He had a fight with the wife. He was coming home from work. He was getting pulled over. what I liked is that he had expressed the positive side of things. I'm telling you, the power of positivity. He was able to say, well, if I have to stay here for a few days, you know, if he got there, and then he said, a few days away from the wife, a few days away from work, I don't have to do anything. He saw the positiveness, the positivity in that. That is powerful. With Tina, and I'm saying this because we have a limited time. So Tina's situation may be something similar for us, because she had people who saw that her teacher initially who saw that there is a lot of potential there, that a lot of her issues were substance related and trauma related, and being able to see that and then going past that and seeing the person and the potential they have, that individual went and supported her. And then they had spoken to her, the mom, and the mom showed. And here we have, and okay, I know you asked about judges. Here we have a judge that was sympathetic to that was able to listen, really listen to the things that were going on, the people who were speaking to her, and she was given an opportunity. So when the community comes out, and the community, I was there say, it's you as providers and other resources that you access, comes out to support an individual because you can see past the trauma issues and see the potential and desires and the goals that individuals have. We can support those. That's being supporting resiliency. And that's also what motivates a lot of individuals to continue in their journey despite their impact of trauma issues. So we know that folks are trauma informed responses, even in the criminal justice system, and the people that we work with or provide services to, those can help support their wellness process, their healing process, you know, and especially if it's probably more likely that you can actually initially meet somebody and start and use a tone of voice and use that engagement approach that you have when you are trauma informed, and you're probably in a position that you might be able to see certain symptoms and maybe ask if that individual would like to speak to someone who specializes in that, and then you support that process. So they're more likely to accept or consider referral from you, depending on how you approach them, the way you give them autonomy, the way you deal with them with integrity and respect. They're more likely to follow through on extra help because they're trusting you. And so your trauma-informed approaches are critical to any other supports that they get. I got a couple of minutes, and only a couple of minutes. So let me see where I got. So I'm gonna get this last slide up, and then you can add whatever comment. Key to becoming trauma-informed: develop understanding. There is absolutely no templated approach to understanding trauma, and the better position, the healthier position we are to be able to recognize that, the better position we are in our own wellness process, we're likely more able to see that in other folks too. Increase awareness. Oh, and the thing about being able to see that in other folks is because some of us have been in the system, not in the system, in the business for such a long time that we actually believe that people are manipulating, that people are kind of maybe trying to scam. We don't want to have that punitive perspective. We want to challenge that. If that comes up because that's what you commonly see, then let's look at it differently. Are people trying to meet their needs to the best way they know how? Let's challenge that thinking, because that can come from us being exposed to certain things all the time. And so let's just challenge and look at the other side and what can, and look to maybe explore why some folks are speaking or behaving the way they are. So that way we can develop the understanding, increase our own awareness about how we can respond. So we want to know what the signs are. And so trauma-informed responses, certainly we always think about safety first, but it also reduces recidivism when we can help folks healthily integrate into the community, when we can help folks be a support system to an individual who can live a quality of life. I can't tell you the times that I've worked with women who had been victims of partner violence, who were still prisoners in their own minds because they were physically out of the situation, but they couldn't get past their own trauma. And so, and it wasn't until they got specialty care, until they had other support system, that they were able to do better in their life and take a certain amount of control. So promoting recovery is part of what we do. Getting the word out takes steps to create trauma-informed systems. Any last comments? Okay. Well, we got through a lot of the content, and I know I kind of skimmed over a lot of it because this is a full day's worth of training. And some of this you already know. But I thought it was a really different thing to do, to be able to hear it straight from the individuals themselves. It's different than you putting you in a group and doing a case study, actually hearing these folks, how they've been able, with support, to actually supersede the trauma. Doesn't hold them prisoners anymore. They have the capacity now to live a healthier, more better quality of life than they were used to. It's not just victim or predator. There's other gray areas in between where people can say they can actually be neither and still empower themselves to like live within wellness. And so, which I really love that about, the strength of people. People don't tend to realize they really do have a lot of strengths. So you folks do have the capacity to always recognize what they bring and really help them extract that and use that for themselves. Thank you for your participation. Thank you for being here. Really want a special shout out and virtual hug for a lot of you folks who shared your own lived experience. You didn't have to, but you did. Thank you. Thank you for